Welcome to the Exponential Athlete Podcast. This is part 2 of my 4-part series on Roger Federer. You can listen to the episodes in isolation if you want. It doesn't matter if you listen to part 2 or part 3. Hopefully you'll find really useful information there, or you can listen to it sequentially in a series as it's been designed. I also provide timestamps in all of the episodes if you're interested in learning about a specific aspect of what we're covering under the umbrella topic. In part 2, we're going to focus on how Roger Federer found the fountain of youth. So Roger had an incredibly long career. He played over 20 years. He played into his 40s and was highly competitive very late into his 30s. He also remained largely injury-free, and he also maintained an incredible joy and enjoyment of the game, which I think can be rare, especially as you get into the later stages of your career, and you might not be able to be physically doing a lot of the same things you were doing before. In this episode, we're going to dive into his goals that facilitated his longevity. We're going to look into his enjoyment of the game and the lifestyle, and how curiosity and variety help to fuel that. We'll take deep dives into both of those topics. We'll finally touch on his training approach for longevity and how he and his team were able to integrate a lot of the things we talked about previously into the training schedule. We'll, of course, touch on sleep, diet, nutrition, exercise, and how that relates to longevity for Roger's career as well. I recently listened or watched a show on HBO. It was where LeBron was being interviewed by Coach K. And LeBron was talking about career longevity, a little self-serving, of course, but he is suggesting that maybe this is something that defines who great players are, even more so than a really great period of performance for a shorter period of time. You take Michael Jordan, who was very successful in the finals, who had essentially every time he got there, he won. Whereas LeBron has had this long career where he's had a lot of shots and didn't necessarily convert all the time. I'm slowly coming to believe that career longevity as a professional athlete is just as valuable as peak performance for a shorter period of time. What it takes to be able to get your body ready, to get your mind ready, to be able to compete at the highest level for 10, 20 years, to me is almost a more difficult challenge than producing really good results for a 4 or 5 year period. And Roger, as he was approaching tennis, was viewing it for this long haul. He wanted to be a legend of the game, someone who was playing for a long period of time and dominating for a long period of time. I'm not going to get into any GOAT debates or anything along those lines, but this longevity aspect is something I think we should look at more carefully, because it is really hard to have a long career as a professional athlete. And if I was playing a professional sport, I would want to have a long career. So what are some of the things that we can do? At first, I believe starts with goals. So this is Roger Federer himself on the importance of goals.
You need to have structured goals. You need to tell yourself, okay, what are my goals for the short term? What are my goals for the long term? Now that I've accomplished almost everything, I'm supposed to go out on the tennis court thinking, let's just play free. It's just hit the ball. Who cares, you know? But this is not how you're going to win matches, because it comes down to margins, and you have to be so clear in your mind exactly what you want to do and what you want to achieve. And for me, it doesn't work without any goals, without any targets. I cannot compete properly.
So what drives Roger Federer? We talked at length about some of the motivating factors for Tiger, but I think it's a little bit simpler for Roger, which I also think is good. Here's a fun story from his childhood. Some teenagers aspire to great riches. Federer did not. That was why his mother, Lynette, was so astonished when she read an interview in a local newspaper in which her son, then a schoolboy without a driver's license, when asked what he would buy with his first prize money check, replied, "A Mercedes." She could not believe he would have given such an answer, and asked the journalist if she could listen to the recording of the conversation. It turned out what he had actually said in Swiss German was "mehr CDs," which means more CDs. So he'd just listen to more music. That's what he would buy with his winnings. Roger was perpetually present in the moment, and we'll talk a little bit about how that played out in his career later. He told me that you're playing every week, and sometimes you're going to feel like you don't enjoy it. You're going to put too much pressure on yourself about winning every week, and it's impossible to win every week on tour. Federer explained to Gauf how he felt as a teenager, how he too had the feeling that you need to win all the time. He said, "I'm going to tell you right now, it's not going to happen." I said, "Of course, yeah. But I didn't really think about it until after I lost in Madrid. And I was like, you know what? He's right. You're not going to win all the time. Whatever happens, just enjoy it. Enjoy the point, enjoy the moment. And I really did do that. I've been trying just to not look too far ahead. So Roger is a little bit more of a realist than a lot of the other people that we've studied. He realizes he's not going to win. He realizes he could win in theory. But when we were looking at Tiger, he expects to win every match. And that can be kind of devastating when you don't. There's a story about when Elin, his wife, had first experienced a win with Tiger. And she says when she was with the Parnevik family, who was another professional golfing family that she worked for before meeting Tiger, they would go celebrate when Jesper would win a tournament. And Tiger tells her basically, you're supposed to win. We don't celebrate. And that's okay. I mean, maybe you don't do that, but you can enjoy the process. It doesn't just have to be an inevitability that you take for granted. I never thought this would happen. I never thought I'd still be playing, but I'm happy with how I play and the little ones love it. So Roger, again, unlike his competition or unlike the other athletes we've studied, he actually went beyond what he thought was possible. Kobe has described that he wanted to get to 8 rings. Obviously, in the episode on Kobe, I talked about how that was probably after he'd already gotten some rings to begin with. And Tiger wanted to chase Jack Nicklaus year after year and beat all of his milestones, which he didn't end up doing. And Roger, on the other hand, never had these incredible expectations, and he was able to go well beyond what he ever thought. His highest aspirations were to get to world number 1, which is, in my opinion, a very good and kind of vague goal for the long term. But he went on to have one of the most dominant careers in tennis. He went on to break Pete Sampras's record of major championships, went on to have an incredible winning streak, staying at number 1 in the world for an incredibly long period of time. So part of goal setting is, where do you set the bar? And it wasn't like Roger didn't aim high. Allegro, who was another tennis player growing up with Federer, remembers all the players in the program filling out a form in which they were supposed to state their tennis goals. Allegro wrote down that he hoped to break into the top 100 in the world. Roger was the only one of us to write that he wanted to become number 1. I'm not sure he believed it 100%, but he put it out there. Roger says it's like a milestone, like top 100, top 10, number 1 in the world. It's those big things you look forward to. So Roger, from a young age, believed that this was possible. At least a part of him believed this enough to put it into the world. And he looked at these as milestones, not necessarily like all-encompassing goals. So what I like about number 1 in the world or top 10 in the world or these types of things is that there's a lot of ways to get to that. You don't have to win a very specific tournament. You don't have to win 8 NBA championships to be able to accomplish that goal. The open-endedness of this long-term goal is very powerful. And what I was surprised to find, particularly in the episode with Shane Battier, is that, for example, he set these intermediary goals. He wanted to get to the league, and then he reassessed. I think that's actually a very natural way to go about goal setting. When I talked to Todd Herman as well, he was suggesting that goals don't necessarily have to be as concrete. I'm going to win 3 championships. I'm going to do X, Y, Z. If they're open-ended and more purpose-driven, if we really focus on shorter-term goals, that's how we have more success. I've arrived where I wanted to be, playing Pete for the first time on center court at Wimbledon, Federer told the Swiss press. I'm not going out there just to win a set. I'm going out there to win. He and Sampras were not strangers. Federer had been a ball boy for Sampras during the ATP event in Basel. They had later met and practiced together on tour after Sampras had taken note of Federer's nearly single-handed destruction of the American Davis Cup team. So obviously we're talking about getting to number 1 in the world in the long term. But in the short term, Roger is trying to win every match, even though it's against, to that point, the greatest grass court player of all time, and he's playing Pete Sampras at Wimbledon. He does go on to win, but I also think that for any tennis player, if you're playing at the highest level, there's a chance that you could beat almost anyone. And remembering that and setting goals around that is effective. We always wanted to play games in sets. Others had less of this intrinsic motivation. The loser always wanted a rematch, and the winner said, sure, let's play again. At Old Boys, we had big groups of juniors. Roger and I always stayed the longest and kept challenging each other in a good way. We could play with each other for hours on end. Besides that, they still played football intensively. Ciudanelli at FC Basel and Federer at Concordia Basel. So Roger, it seems like, has always been in pursuit of games, not necessarily the legacy in the long term. He's able to differentiate these two things. He loves to play, and there's joy, there's a goal in just winning each individual game ever since he was a child. He says, number one in the world is something that comes naturally when you win big tournaments. He was most interested in the big tournament at hand. I don't like to just look at the slams as the only thing that matters, Federer said. For me, it means the other tournaments, when I'm competing against the best players or playing in front of thousands of people, don't really matter. I have 32 titles, and 6 of them are Grand Slams at the time. So you see the majority are other tournaments. So Roger is going in looking to compete at his highest level at each tournament. Obviously, he's trying to win and expects he can win at each tournament. But like we said before, he's not necessarily expecting to win every tournament. He has an understanding that he won't, and that hedges him from the downside of losing a lot. You know, in tennis, in golf, in a lot of these sports, you usually lose more than you win, unless you were Roger from, I think it was like 2003 to 2007. Roger said, actually, I'm not too much of a box ticker, to be honest. So, of course, Roger has these things he wants to do. We had seen in the clip that he thinks goals are important, but for him, it's all about enjoying each game, trying to win each game, breaking it down into the smallest kernel of itself. I think this is a good summary of how he views these process goals. And this is him talking about the match in 2007 that he had with Rafa in the Australian Open, where he went on to win in the final.
I think it was a very much of a mental match. You know, as much as we're talking tactically about the match, at the end, Severin and Ivan and me, we said, it's all mental. It's just, you have to go out there and believe that point for point, whatever happens, nothing's going to change. You just got to believe and keep coming at Rafa. And then if he's too good, that's too good, you know. But I'm not going to get down on myself. And it was easy to tell myself, just, you have nothing to lose, Roger. Like I said on the court, it's okay to lose. Like him probably too, it's okay to lose. But you still want it badly. So, and I think that combination got me the win tonight.
One aspect that I really like about Roger's goals is they seem to be largely controllable. He's pretty objective about these goals. So Roger played in a ton of French Opens. He lost a lot of matches to Rafa in the French Open. I don't actually believe he ever beat Rafa in the French Open. Actually, he definitely didn't ever beat Rafa in the French Open. And a lot of people were asking if he won the French Open and Rafa wasn't there and he didn't play against him, would it still be meaningful? I mean, it would be great to beat Rafa at the French, but it's not something I feel my career necessarily needs. Some might think that's what form it should take, but then again, I've never played Rafa in all my US Open finals. It happens as it happens. You just can't make up the draws. You have to beat who's on the other side of the court. Don't get me wrong, it would be amazing, but I really don't know if it would be any more special. So Roger's goals, the things he's trying to achieve, they shouldn't be dependent on luck. There's a chance he never runs into Rafa in another Ronald Garros final. And that's okay. He understands that the reality of his goals, and his goals should be set on things that he can control. He says, I do draw strength from it. The idea is that you want to prove to yourself you can do it, and not to other people. That's why for me, this rivalry with Rafa Nadal, okay, it's interesting maybe, but in the end, I care about winning tournaments. That for me is the bottom line. And if Rafa Nadal happens to be on the other side, even better, because then I can beat the main rival or make a great story on top of that. But I think what people like Tiger and I are more interested in is not who you're playing or racing against. You want to do it the best you can. It's important you can wake up in the morning and go to bed feeling good about yourself and your effort. So I found this pretty interesting. Roger is trying to face what's in front of him. His goal is to do the best he can in any challenge that he has. Again, something completely in his control. He can't necessarily control who his opponent is. But tennis is a little different from golf. In golf, you're playing against the field. You're playing against a golf course. In tennis, you're playing against a very specific opponent. So should you prepare very specifically for opponents that you always have trouble with? It's interesting to talk about Rafa, and we'll talk a little bit about, well, we talked a little bit about this in the last episode, is Rafa was a tough stylistic matchup for Roger. But if Roger spends too much time preparing for Rafa, no one really plays tennis like he does. So is he giving up ground to the rest of the tennis players, the rest of the field, because he's hyper-focusing on one person? That's a trade-off that he had to make. And I think his decision-making process around that is very interesting. A good look into Roger's goals is around how he returns from injury. This is when he injured his knee and he was coming back in 2017. When he came back, number one was never, in the craziest dream, something we thought would have been possible, Lubitsch said, because it was never a goal. To be number one, you have to play a lot. That was not our priority. But he started to really roll. For Federer, the challenge was more mental than physical at this stage, even on a post-operative knee. You need to know yourself, and you need to be honest with yourself, he told me. When you go to, say, Rotterdam, you need to go there with fire. If you're not excited at this age, don't do it. It's that simple. He had gone with just the right degree of fire, and the Monday morning after the tournament, when he clicked on the ATP website, he was back at number one, the oldest player to hold the spot since ATP published its first rankings in 1973. I thought this was pretty interesting. So Roger is setting goals based on what he believes to be a reality and what he wants to chase after. So Roger still thought he could win major championships, but he thought he would need more rest than would allow him to play enough tournaments to rise in the ATP rankings. So the ATP rankings, you get points for when you play in tournaments and you perform well. If you play a lot of tournaments, you get more points. So Roger was setting the goals based on what he believed to be possible, and he wasn't putting extra pressure on himself to do something that was outside of what he really wanted. Winning majors or winning tournaments was his biggest priority, not necessarily ranking. And that changed from earlier in his career. He wanted to be number one to begin with, but late in his career, he was able to shift this goal so it met his own needs in a very effective way. Now, how goals all tie in to longevity is that Roger viewed his goals for the long term. This is something that was really telling for me. It was becoming increasingly clear that Federer was driven by his place in history. He once said, "I know I have to live for tennis. I mustn't get injured, and I have to stay healthy. I'm not going to be the best player in the world by fooling around. I have to be professional and serious and stay that way for a long time. The difference between legends and those who are just good players, legends are capable of keeping it going for a long time. That's what I want to achieve, to become a legend." So just as I talked about with LeBron James at the beginning of this episode, for Roger, greatness is measured over time. And again, this is something that's a little bit different for a lot of people. But if that was Roger's goal, then he had clearly done everything lined up to achieve that. He won major tournaments over the course of, I think it was 15 different years, a span of 15 years. And based on the goal criteria that Roger set, he was clearly successful. I would argue that based on the goal criteria that Tiger and Kobe set, they were successful outwardly, but maybe they weren't necessarily successful internally because their goals were not necessarily matching what they had seen in their vision. Roger says, "Wimbledon will always stay number one in my heart. That's clear because of the emotions I had there and because of my idols. They all won over there, but I'm aware that if I can win the French, what it does for my spot in history. So for this reason, I think this will always have a very special place for me in terms of how I prepare for it, because I'll only get another 7 to 10 to maybe 15 maximum chances." 15, the reporter sputtered. Federer was then 23. 15 more French Opens was a whole lot of long-term thinking. Federer laughed, "Hey, if you look at Andre, you almost have to go there." He said of Agassi, who had reached the US Open final later that year at age 35, "Look, I like the challenge. On clay, I have many tough opponents, more than on other surfaces. And I think for this reason, I even look harder on this surface. It's just a pity, a good pity, that I play so well on all surfaces, so it doesn't allow me to have the best preparation for clay or have enough hours on clay or enough tournaments." There's a lot in there. So one, he's looking to Agassi, someone who's played late into their career. The second thing is he does end up playing in the French Open, I believe, beyond 38, which is 15 years beyond what they were describing here, which I think is really cool. This vision that he has comes into fruition. He is from the onset thinking about this long career, thinking about becoming a legend of the game. And if we use the goal setting criteria that we talked about before, or we're setting vaguer long-term goals and making them more specific as we go, this is really matching that fairly clearly. So if you want to be a legend of the game, that's fairly vague. But as Roger is getting up in his career, he's realizing that the French Open and him winning all 4 Grand Slam tournaments is an important part of that. So he's able to refine that and make it more specific as it becomes closer to reality. He's also knocked at the door of the French Open multiple times to this point. And I think it's pretty impressive that he was able to do this, maybe intuitively, maybe he had help, but he was able to create this framework that worked for him without necessarily putting additional pressure on himself. The goal when I took my break of 6 months was doing this for the next couple of years, not just for one tournament, Federer said. I understand people who say, oh, this would be a perfect moment to go, but I feel like I've put in much work and I love it so much, and I still have so much in the tank. So his goals and his view of the long term really shape how he practices, how he trains, and when he takes rest. And to me, this is why goals are so important to set, is that if you know roughly where you want to go, and if you know in the short term what you want to achieve, you can align those things. So we have a point, or sort of a loose point, that's way out here. And in the short term, we can start lining up other points to be able to get to that. That is the value of goals. They're giving anyone a huge amount of direction and getting you started going in the right place. As I mentioned before, Roger is able to reevaluate his goals as he goes as well. And that's something that I've personally changed my view on. I thought you had to set them and just keep going on that path. But the more great athletes I talk to, the more people I study, the more I realize that they have iterated their goals as they've evolved as a person, as an athlete as well. Roger says, I'm number one, and you can't get ranked higher than one. So now what? What do I do now? That, Paul Annacone revealed, was the question Roger Federer was constantly trying to address during his 300 plus weeks at the top of the rankings. The folks who just touched the world number one ranking, they've achieved something pretty amazing, Annacone said. But the people who stay there for a long time, that's spectacular. So Roger has reached his goal that he wanted to do as a kid, and now he has to go through and think about what it means to be number one. I think that Roger was great at looking internally and viewing his improvement as an end. So how does he become the best tennis player possible? And in part 3, we'll talk a little bit about how he used his competition to sharpen himself as well. It's not that you don't enjoy the accomplishment of being number one, but you have to consider why you're playing and how you define yourself as a tennis player. So you're thinking, what do I do? Is it now about winning tournaments or solely about winning majors? Players like Pete and Roger need to have a clear idea of what they want to do next. So Roger obviously was able to do that. He went on to win 20 major championships, which at the time absolutely blew through Pete Sampras' record. And Roger says it's really about breaking the records, not necessarily keeping the records, which I really like. One of Federer's motivations for continuing to compete was that he wanted his children to be old enough to remember watching him play. That was certainly the case in the 2015 Wimbledon Championships, when the Federer girls were approaching their 6th birthdays. So Roger is able to also create this new goal of having his kids watch him play. We saw something similar with Tiger in part 3 of that series, where one of his aspirations for being dominant again or winning in 2019 was to show his son Charlie that he still got it, which I really like. There's multiple places where athletes or people can pull motivation from. And to me, that's a really wholesome one. And I really like to see that in athletes. You don't have the same goals when your player is 19 or 31. When you work with a 19-year-old, you work long-term, thinking about today, but thinking about goals for the whole career arc. The more you get older, the more each season and the moment itself become important. Roger has an incredible capacity to still progress. That's why he's still on top. Mentally, he's very strong and can adapt to the physical side too. So this is Pierre Paganini, who we talked about in the last episode, his fitness trainer. And it's interesting to see this perspective. I don't think many 19-year-olds are thinking for the long term. I think most of them are saying, I'm in college, how do I get to the next level? They're not thinking about, how do I sustain a career for the longer term? They're not thinking about, how do I keep my body healthy for the longer term? And to me, it's really impressive that this was built into Roger's philosophy from when he was a kid, or when he decided that he wanted to be a legend of the game. A cool aspect of the way that Roger sets goals is that he allows himself to surpass his expectations. Would Roger himself have imagined he would go on to dominate like that? He says, no, I don't think so. What he went on to do was special. He's incredibly talented, and as he got more and more confident, he would reach a point where he felt that no matter what he did, he wasn't going to lose. But thinking about what Roger went on to do in tennis, that doesn't make that defeat any easier to take. So Roger is able to play freely without expectations because he didn't necessarily have the expectations of where he was going to go. He's focusing on the short term with these goals, and that allows him to play great in the moment. He knows he can beat any given opponent. He knows he can win any given tournament at a certain point. But the expectation to win another one and another one, that doesn't necessarily fall on him. That's outward looking, not inward looking. And he has the freedom to play in a very effective way. I think Roger is one of the players that has the most access to a flow state and the freedom that he's creating for himself without the added pressure of these very specific goals for how he performs in each individual tournament is a very powerful thing. So again, we've talked a lot about goals on this podcast in the past, and that's because I think it's important to reiterate them. And it's very important for every athlete to have at least some form of goals. I think goals can hurt us just as much as they can help us. And if we're too specific with what we want, that can be really damaging to us in the long term. In the short term, we can be really specific. We can achieve really impressive things. Again, I'm going to try to find someone or a deep dive to do specifically on goal setting that I think will hopefully be helpful to anyone. When we turn this on ourselves, what is our vision? What is my vision for this podcast? I say it in most of the episodes. It's to create the most comprehensive study of greatness in sports ever compiled, and to be the best version of myself as a podcaster as I can be, to continually grow and improve. As you can see, I've left it a little bit open to what that means because there's no necessarily greatest researcher in sport award that I know of. And what are the small specific things that you can individually do to get there? So goals aren't necessarily about what the long-term purpose is. They're about the small implementations that we do every day. And then the last thing I want to focus on is, are we in control of our goals? So something I think about, for example, with team sports, basketball, football, baseball, you can't necessarily directly influence if your team wins or not. You might not have great coaches. Your team might not get along. They might not have trust and mission focus like we talked about with the Shane Battier episode. But what do you control as it relates to that team? Can you be the best teammate? Can you be the best contributor? Those are things that hopefully we can measure and evaluate more effectively. We talked about Roger's goals and how they relate directly to longevity, but how impressive was Roger's longevity to begin with? And what other factors went into him producing this long and healthy career? So let's look at Roger's career compared to Pete Sampras, who is one of his closest comparables. That night in Argentina, he was already 31, the same age Pete Sampras, one of his role models, had been when he won a record 14th Grand Slam singles title at the 2002 United States Open. That turned out to be Sampras's final tour match and would have been one of the ultimate walk-off home runs in sports if Sampras had not waited another year to formally announce his retirement. Stefan Edberg, another of Federer's boyhood tennis heroes, retired at age 30. But Federer was not late in his career in Buenos Aires, as most tennis experts and fans would understandably have imagined. He was still smack in the middle of his run and would play on effectively into the 2020s as his generational tennis peers moved into business, commentary, or coaching Federer's younger rivals. This is fascinating to me. Of the 128 men who played singles at the 1999 French Open, Federer's debut Grand Slam tournament, he was the last one still playing singles on tour. Come on, he said when I offered up that stat. Nobody else left. So Roger has not only outplayed his competition, he has outlasted his competition on the court, which I think is really, really impressive. Again, it's not just a long career, it's also a resilient career. From his debut on tour through the 2020 season, he never once retired from a match, which might be the most mind-boggling tennis achievement. That should be regarded in the same breath as Cal Ripken Jr., Andy Roddick said, referring to Major League Baseball's Iron Man. In tennis, that's almost an impossibility. Nobody would take never retiring in a match over winning a Grand Slam, but I don't think anyone will ever do that again over a 20-year career. And it's not like he hasn't gotten hurt during matches. Unreal. Absolutely unreal that the best tennis player in history has never left a match. Aside from taking care of yourself and leading a healthy life, not damaging or punishing your body, you have to have a little bit of luck to have a genetically strong body. So Roger obviously did have some luck. I won't say that that wasn't involved, but as we'll see a little bit later in the training section, we'll see how much focus there was on longevity for him and some of the very unique things that he did in an effective way. I also think it's important to note that Roger did not grind out his career. We look at Kobe, for example, and he was truly grinding out those last couple of years. His body wasn't cooperating. He was constantly giving up. He was hurting in practice. He would come out of the games and not be able to go back in because his back would freeze up. Or more likely, he wouldn't want to come out of the games because he knew his back would freeze up. Let's compare that to how Roger is feeling late in his career. I feel good. I don't feel any different from, say, 4 years ago. Really, I don't. I might pay more attention to the signals my body sends me, but I also know my body better than I did before. And as the years go on, I guess you want to try new things, although that isn't necessarily linked to age. Yes and no, no and yes. When he enters into an analysis, Federer is extremely rational. He looks at all the variants and hypotheses. In a certain way, he does the reporter's job for them. It's always about saying, okay, you did such and such thing for this and that reason, but maybe you did it because you wanted something different, something fresh, new, to try something else. That could be true for anything, and you should certainly listen to your body. And not just your body, I think the mind becomes more important as well. How much willingness and passion do you have for being there? How much willingness and passion do you have for playing and winning? Why do you keep doing it? Are you doing it for the right reasons? I think that, in my opinion, that's more important than the whole physical debate that the world emphasizes. So again, if we look at a Kobe Bryant, his mind was still there, but his body completely gave out. Roger, his mind is clearly there, but his body kept going because I believe he took care of it in maybe a slightly more effective way. There was also probably some genetics and some other things that played into that, but I largely believe process is what kept Roger largely healthy, more so than nature type factors. Watching Federer stay fresh and eager into his 30s against logic and against tennis precedent, it was intriguing to realize that his ability to remain in the moment was in fact about forethought. If he was relaxed and accommodating despite all the forces pulling at him, it was because he knew himself and his microcosm well enough to avoid the pitfalls that would likely snuff out his pilot light. So we've talked about this idea of planning, of structure, creating freedom, and creating his ability to stay in the present. We talked about that with Kobe. Roger is exhibiting that here, but that's also one of the keys to his success over the course of his career. Something that was not unique to Roger, but something that helped him dramatically more than the other athletes we've studied is he absolutely loved the lifestyle, or he convinced himself to love the lifestyle. So first is his love of tennis. This is uniform across all of the greats we've studied. I don't think anyone would argue Tiger doesn't love golf. Kobe didn't love basketball. But Roger's love for tennis is something that I think is worth another look. I never fell out of love with the sport, Federer told me. Never. Chasing dreams doesn't always have to be misery and all sacrifice. It should be enjoyment. And I think the macro effect on everybody was, you can actually be a pretty damn normal and pretty darn good person and still be a sports icon, which is interesting. Roger has this incredible ability to recharge and stay fresh through not just tennis, but through the surrounding things about the lifestyle, which again was completely novel compared to someone like a Kobe or a Tiger. The things on the court, working with teammates, or off the golf course with Tiger were draining for him. This isn't necessarily true with Federer. He's incredibly efficient with his process. His emotional process, his practicing, everything he does seems to have a recharging effect on him. The social interaction, all that other stuff, it's like it regenerates him more than draining the fuel tank. The French have a fine expression that applies to Federer.
Joindre l'utile à l'agréable.
Yeah, I'm not going to try to attempt that one. My French is not very good, even though I had to be there a couple of years ago for work, which translates loosely as combining business with pleasure, but is actually broader in scope, encompassing the tasks of daily life. If you're going to empty the dishwasher or stack the wood, find a way to make it novel and amusing. This was a key element in Federer's career longevity. Too much routine can kill the joy. Too much consistent focus can grind you down. Pierre Paganini, his intuitive fitness trainer, certainly understood this, but so did Mirka, who had learned through painful experience. Early on, when I became number one, We decided with Pierre that less is more, Federer told me in 2011. We have to take care of the body because Mirka's body went first because maybe she overpracticed. So I think she could also give me some advice, some know-how. Her body is still fragile today when she goes and does sports. Mine isn't, and it's incredible because I've done so much more than she has. So I guess it's a bit of luck too, and smartness because of the people that have surrounded me. And this is where it's definitely been so helpful to be with her for sure. So I think it's important to start with the beginning of that, is that Roger gets joy in all of these things, in the travel, in the lifestyle and bringing his kids along, in the news, any of these types of things, or doing the media. Again, not something we can say for many athletes, but he also has his team around him that give him perspective on these types of things. And his team also helps him to get the relevant rest that's required. They've built in this less is more approach, which can help recharge in very unique ways. At the end of a long tennis year, some can sound exhausted by it all, but not Federer. Federer's love for the sport, the sheer pleasure he takes from being on the court, was undiminished. Physically and mentally, Roger still wants to be there, and that's incredible at his age, said Sampras. He's been playing just the right amount to stay fresh. He still enjoys the travel and loves the game. So there's some pretty interesting research, which I've linked in the show notes, about how enjoyable activities are beneficial for physical and psychological well-being. If you're thinking about Roger's experience, is that he's enjoying the tennis, he's enjoying the travel, he's getting the rest he needs, he's enjoying spending time with his family and his trainers, he's going to get the benefits of these physical and psychological well-being things, which could lead to less injury. It could lead to a lot of these things. Let's compare this to other players again. I really like comparing, for example, a Kobe to a Michael Jordan, or a Tiger to a Jack Nicklaus, or a Federer to a Pete Sampras, because they're the closest comparisons. And we can see how maybe they differed or evolved over time. Let's look at Pete Sampras first. Traveling the world drained Pete's energy. Roger gets energy from it. Sampras was struck above all by Federer's openness to new experiences and his enthusiasm for some aspects of the tennis circuit that had sapped Sampras's will to continue. Roger loves the travel, Sampras said. He loves the new cities, the new people, just a different personality, so much less anxiety than someone like me. When I traveled, it was always work, and work was stressing and stressing. I carried the weight of number one and winning majors, and it definitely hit me harder in some ways. Social interaction drained Sampras's fuel tank, not a problem for Federer, with his booming voice and ability to joke, chat, and to flip on the switch when it came to walk on the court. So this is very textbook extroversion. Not all athletes we've studied are extroverted. Tiger and Kobe definitely were not. But if you frame it the right way, extroversion can be a superpower. If you frame introversion the right way, introversion can be a superpower. I think Federer took this characteristic that he had and he leveraged it to the max capacity that he could. And we can do that with any characteristic that has two sides. And I think that that's really important for us to realize. Pete was always much more insular. He kept things small and more controlled. The group around him was smaller. It was a much more controlled environment. Roger travels with 4 kids now. He has a big team. He's much more involved in external off-the-court stuff. He has a lot more sponsors. He's a global ambassador. Roger does things very differently because he chooses to. Pete did it the way that he needed to in order to be successful and stay clear about what his priorities were. So both of these approaches, again, not necessarily saying one is better than the other, but they were both by choice. I know, for example, if I was a professional athlete, I probably wouldn't have a capacity to do all the things that Roger's doing. I'd probably be somewhere in between what he's doing and what Pete Sampras is doing. But we all have to find what our limits are. And fortunately, if you're at the highest level of sports, you have a lot of control financially of being able to pick and choose things. It's also important to be able to say no. And Roger does do that fairly effectively. We'll touch on that in a bit. This is Andy Roddick on how he viewed Roger, or how he would compare to Federer here. I wouldn't be able to do it, Roddick told me. I was a stress ball without family obligations and all that. I needed to have tennis, and now I need to have a family and business. I wouldn't have been able to intertwine all of them. In 2017, Roddick asked Federer about the challenges, and Federer responded that it was particularly fun some weeks when he and his family all shared the same room, as they had one year at the Western and Southern Open in Cincinnati. Roddick was flabbergasted. I was like, what do you mean? You all stayed in the same room, like a bunch of rooms connected? And Roger's like, no, we all had a big room. And I'm like, see, that's the stuff no one else does or can do without losing their minds. That's not a real thing, to stay in a room with 4 kids and a wife and win a Master Series event. But Federer thrived on compartmentalizing, taking his mind off of tennis while taking his children to a museum in Paris or a park in Melbourne helped him to fully focus when the time came to perform on the court. Before a night match, everyone else is in their room trying to get rest with every machine hooked up to them, making sure they're ready, eating perfect, and Roger is out there in Central Park with the kids. I think that relaxed approach really benefits his tennis. So you're seeing how he is creating a lifestyle that only he can live, but he's leveraging this lifestyle, spending time with his kids, these things outside of tennis, to actually improve his tennis because it relaxes him. It takes the edge off. We're all probably different in what we enjoy, what makes us tick. For example, I love reading. That's why for me, reading 5-10 books for each of these podcast episodes, it's not a big deal to me. For someone else, that might be pulling teeth. Someone else might, feel the same way about podcast or watching video. I can't sit through a movie. It just is not stimulating in the same way for me. And so we all have to leverage our own unique strengths to be able to put in the effort that we uniquely can. It's also interesting to contrast this to not just players who are really serious, but players who maybe aren't taking the sport as seriously. Tennis at the beginning of the 2000s was Safin, etc. It was a big party. Let's go play some tennis sometimes, and the rest you're going to party. He was one of those guys, he being Roger, who came in and said, hey, you can party if you want. I'm not on this wagon. So tennis changed, the mentality changed, the players started to take care of themselves more. They started to party less, drink less, smoke less, and be more professional. And that, trying to chase him, it raised the bar. I do believe that Novak Djokovic is the player he is now thanks to Roger. So there's a couple things to unpack here. So Roger very clearly was willing to go his own way. We also talked about in the last episode how Roger did like to go out. He would have some drinks. He enjoyed that aspect of the tour, but he was able to determine what worked for him over time, the lifestyle he wanted to live, and create that very specifically on the circuit. And people followed suit. They also found what worked for them, as in Novak Djokovic. I loosely touched on it before, but I want to take a deep dive into Roger's love of the game. So a couple of people have described this as one of his greatest talents. And why is love for a sport a true talent? This is Paul Annacone, one of Federer's coach, also Pete Sampras's coach, on Federer's talent for loving tennis.
Roger's ability to have this youthful exuberance and joy and love for tennis after so many years is something I've never seen before in my life. But that's allowed him to be successful until 39 years of age.
Federer's love for the sport, the sheer pleasure he takes from being on the court, was undiminished. Federer has an indefatigable joy for tennis, but also for life in general. For Federer, tennis has always been more fun when playing for the biggest titles and on the biggest courts. So if tennis is fun, if winning is fun, if the fight is fun, as Rafa says, then you probably want to do it a lot. You want to practice a lot. You want to get as good as you can. That's one of the beauties of love for a sport that you have. He's much more interested in tennis than most people realize. He lives to hit the ball, to try out new strikes. If the ball is close to his feet, he passes it in some way, or he hits it with different spins and keeps the ball boys busy. He's more interested in the game and in the different aspects of tennis than any other player I've seen. His love of tennis is huge. So something that I've been seeing is that the more you love something, the more nuance there is, the deeper you can get into it, and the more things that you find to love. If he's experimenting, if he's trying new things, if he really loves the sport in that way and loves innovating, he's going to keep doing that in ways other people have never done before. What I find incredible about Roger is that he's maintained that joy over all these years in a sport where the wear and tear are so great, which can be so frustrating, such a struggle. And it's not that he has easy opponents. On the contrary, Rafa and Djokovic, he had 2 rivals who also made history. It was the most fiercely contested era. Nevertheless, with Roger, you always had the feeling he's all about the game and all about the sport itself, and everything else is secondary. I find that brilliant, how he kept that joy of playing and his looseness. So there is truly a skill in keeping joy and love for the game, and your team can play a huge part of that as well. And in the next sections, we're going to talk about how he developed that skill. But I want to go into a couple other things before we get to there. Was Federer showered with talent? The question is how you define talent. His athleticism, his balance, and his agility, the way he anticipates his opponent's shots, and his variety, that's all very impressive. But probably his greatest talent is that he simply loves to play tennis, and he loves it every day. That is an enormous source of energy for him. I don't think you can teach that. That's his character. He was born to play tennis. So again, we talk about, and everyone in the media, all his opponents talk about how talented he was, but is talent for a sport just a derivative of how much you love it, or in some sense a derivative of how much you love it and how much you're willing to put into it? It allowed him to put in hours of practice that other people wouldn't. It allowed him probably to experiment and innovate in ways that other people wouldn't, because he just loved the process so much. And I would argue that you can actually teach love, especially growing up, especially as a kid. I think that there are some very specific things you can do that would help anyone really fall in love with a game. Obviously, there's some natural inclination. There's also skill and physical elements. But to me, this isn't something that is just God-given or you're born with. There are many ways that you can create this environment for love for anyone growing up. He wanted to compete and win. He loved the game, and he loved to win even more. His will to win was huge. So obviously Roger, as a kid, was maybe too much of a perfectionist, but wanting to win and loving to win, there's nothing wrong with that in any sense of it. And if you really enjoy winning, you're going to try to work harder and probably do some extra things to get that extra gear into winning. So maybe let's dive into why Roger loves the sport. And in the next section, we'll go even deeper. So first, it piques his curiosity. We talked about in the last episode in part 1, how curious and playful and childish he was. Tennis keeps him stimulated. It also gives him relationships. He's met his wife at the Olympics, Mirka, playing tennis. He's met an incredible team. He's met all of his best friends. It's given him access to all these different experiences and being able to travel. And that is where variety comes in. He has all these access to these other things where he can meet and satiate his curiosity. And again, we'll touch on curiosity and this variety here soon. I want to drill down into a couple more areas that he loves about the career, and then we can see how that spins into the curiosity and variety. So first, Roger loves the people. So he's unbelievably curious, and he's creating relationships as he goes along the way. In the 20 years I've been on tour now, I got to know a lot of people. In every city we know somebody, and we're always happy to catch up with them. And that's why our life on the tour does feel kind of like home. Anacone struggles to recall an event during his years coaching Federer where there was not at least 3 or 4 different couples of friends on site to spend time with the Federers. They had dinners, they spent some days together, and they would hang out and chat and go for walks and do things couples do together. And that separation for Roger was fuel for him to keep doing tennis at a high level. So even when Roger was by himself at events, he would pass out keys to anyone to come do an open house at his place. He loved talking to meeting people. And this might seem foreign to people, but for a lot of people, that's unbelievably rejuvenating. I love doing interviews personally. Those energize me a tremendous amount. Me talking to a camera like this isn't quite as energizing, but for some people that just really does, help to recharge and rejuvenate. Again, not necessarily for everyone. One quality in particular that impressed Gudenhard about Federer was his way of making people worldwide feel that he didn't want to be anywhere else at that particular time. That's why he's so popular everywhere. He makes everyone feel, wherever he is, that I'm madly happy to be here now. I'm madly happy to be in Paris. I love being at Wimbledon. I love being in New York so much, but I always love being in Shanghai. Whether that's the case, I can't say. He might have days where he's not so enthusiastic. Still, I've never had the impression that he was in a place he didn't want to be. So there's a couple elements of that. So one, he does want to be at all these places. He does genuinely want to learn about the people that he's interviewing or that he's around. He's just that curious that he's interested in the journeys of other people. But by telling himself that he's happy to be places, he likes to meet people, he's reinforcing that message to himself. I've talked about this before. The person that listens to us more than anyone else or hears us talk is ourselves. And the more we say these types of things, the more we believe them and the more that we're aligned with these things. We look at the affirmations that Tiger did, talking to himself about his belief in himself, and clearly those were ingrained. This isn't all that different. What you say in the media, what you say to your competitors, what you're telling people becomes a reality, or how you view reality. He would ask about you first, and not in a perfunctory manner, inquiring about your own journey to the particular place, your own perceptions of the tournament, the country, the people. So again, Roger is genuinely interested, and he tells himself he's genuinely interested continually. As we talked about before with seeing friends everywhere, that's also potentially an advantage. If you have people that give you recommendations, that can give you insights about the weather, that can tell you about the nature of a tournament or where to park, you get all these little insights that are different from what the other players are getting when they're completely insulated. Roger also loves the culture and the travel, which I think is different than a lot of players. A lot of players, they just go and stay at the hotel, they play tennis and they leave. That was not the case for Roger. In the beginning, everyone says it's such a hassle. All they do is talk about the long ride to the tournament, and the site is so big, and it's New York, and the traffic is everything. But I've started to look at these tournaments from a different view. What else do they have to offer off the court? I know it's around the grounds, but you can't measure a tournament just for around the grounds. You also have to see what the city can do. And this is an incredible city. He's talking about New York. It never gets boring, always something to do. The best restaurants, they have great shopping. It's just a great buzz. So Roger would not stay in the official hotel for the tournaments. Most tournaments, he would try a different hotel every time. He would get some novelty built in. And that's because that is something that recharged him. Monotony, just like with Tiger Woods in his practice, was something that was a kryptonite for Federer. And he knew that about himself, and he was able to build an enjoyment or a lack of monotony into this lifestyle that he has. There are little things you start doing over the years to get away from the sport and do something different. Because tennis is a big focus, there's also something else in life, the private side with my girlfriend and my family. I want to keep that intact as well, because I can only play good tennis when I'm happy. Federer's priority, even back then, was to keep himself fresh physically and mentally, to be smart about scheduling and training loads, but also to be smart about how he put himself in the spotlight and in group settings. By also getting these different hotels, he's separating himself from his competition. He's able to get a little bit more privacy, and he's built that in. This is a part of his recovery that he is designing his travel style around that. This is Roger talking about travel. Think about today. We left with sunrise, beautiful weather in Indian Wells, and we get here, and it's cold and a totally different vibe. That's the beauty of travel, of seeing different places. I love it, I do. I still love it. So in the chatter episode, that sort of deep dive that we did during the Tiger series, we talked about awe and how important it can be for eliminating chatter. What if Roger, every time he's traveling and seeing these new things, he's filling himself with this sense of awe? That's a pretty powerful thing to do for his mental health, his perspective, and his performance. And I think that is a power or something that he's developed that he can leverage. Roger's life, if it's not hectic, it's not Roger's life, because it's all he knows. He confessed that he had no particular need for solitude, even if he did feel the need to reconnect with nature and a more peaceful environment after so much time on the circuit. He made it clear, though, that he is not yet weary of the travel. So there's two things here. First, Roger knows no different, and he's built it how he wants it. That to me is something very special, is that you can create the life you want around the confines of your sport, and he's done that. But there's also a power in these green spaces, which is a completely different topic that we again touched in that chatter episode, is nature, greenery. It can be very good for your performance and focus to be around those types of things. You know, within that umbrella of travel and the culture, there's also a love for the language and the people. And Roger went out of his way to try to learn the language and get involved in the culture. So he already knew 3 languages. So he speaks French, English, Swiss German, and then maybe like straight up German. So 3 or 4, depending how you look at it. But when he goes to China, he's trying to learn Mandarin, and he's hiring coaches, and he wants to be able to greet the crowd and connect with the people in that way. There is no obligation for him to do that, but he's doing it because he's interested in it. And in part 3, we'll talk about how that can be a little bit of an advantage. And this isn't to say he's just going around willy-nilly. He's going and just traveling, booking these random hotels. There is some structure to how he's designing his life. There are some parameters, there are some guidelines. Roger's not going to go out staying up all night and partying until 5 a.m, but he'll go to a museum, he'll have dinner with a group of friends, and he'll come home at 11:30. He doesn't like to live like a recluse. I think that he really educated me as to how life is different for different people, and the things that you do to help relax you actually allow you to be a better performer in the biggest moments if you manage them the right way. And that's what he did. So Roger, again, is not going out crazy late. He's seeing friends, but I had dinner with a professional golfer a little while ago. It was the night before the tournament starts. We get to 8:30. He's like, all right, guys, you got to leave. And you can do that. I mean, that is the control that he has, and he gets to enjoy that style of thing. And he found very clearly what provides him energy, as we said before. So it's not just the city and the travel that he really enjoys. He also gets to share this experience with his family. So this is something unique that is kind of a superpower for Roger. So after Roger learned that Mirka was pregnant with his twins, he said, I was like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. He went out the next day and defeated the young and dangerous Juan Martín del Potro 6-3, 6-0, 6-0 in the quarterfinals. The twins gave me wings, right? Federer said. It was like, okay, seems like it's not affecting me if Mirka goes to a screening or anything. That was a good start. It gave me confidence. 6 months after becoming a father, Federer won another Grand Slam at the 2010 Australian Open. Indeed, his first major as a dad almost came sooner than that, as he led Juan Martín del Potro 2-1 in the final of the 2009 US Open. Federer's second Grand Slam as a father came in at the 2012 Wimbledon Championships. So a family life and the kids traveling with him don't necessarily affect his tennis, but they also kind of help in a different way. And you'll see that here. If Roger had not felt able to travel the circuit with his family, it's a moot point whether he would have continued to take such pleasure from his tennis, or whether he would have continued to play at all. After the birth of his daughters in the summer of 2009 and his sons, who arrived in the spring of 2014, while Federer and Mirka have the means to travel regularly by private jet and employ nannies, those luxuries did not necessarily mean the family life on tour always runs in a straightforward way. Yes, Roger travels first class, if not on his own jet, Boris Becker said, but I'm sure there are challenges with the kids adapting to time changes and also climate changes. But somehow Federer has found a way of making it work. In part because spending time with his family has allowed Federer to make sense of the madness of his celebrity. So there's a humbling and a perspective taking side of all this travel. So yes, it's chaotic. Mirka really helps with that. But there's also something comforting around being around your kids, about having them with you, that he really relishes in. It's long been clear that Federer had a love of the game and the tour that was well beyond the norm. But this was the first time I realized it was beyond the norm, even for a tennis champion. Many new fathers have returned to the court soon after the birth of their children, including Andre Agassi, but Federer seemed particularly eager to take the whole family on the road right away and then stay on the road. So for Federer, this is just part of the process. This is something he loves. Why not have his family, everything he enjoys, everywhere he goes? And some might find that stressful. He obviously found a way to make it work for him. And maybe that wouldn't work for everyone. But again, his team, his family, his lifestyle was built to cater to this. He also created a routine around this, which definitely helped. It's not like everything was running willy-nilly. So one of the first things he does on being shown that week's hotel suite is to arrange what you might call the children's corner. Moving from one hotel to another could potentially be bewildering for Federer's children, identical twin daughters Mila Rose and Charlene Rivera, and non-identical twin boys Leo and Lenny. So they ensure that one part of every room they stay in always is the same. The arrangement of toys helps the children feel they're in a familiar environment. Structured days and regular daily routines also allow them to make sense of the nomadic lifestyle. So there's also structure added for Roger himself. When you control or can adjust your environment, you're building control into your life. Again, I can't underplay Mirka's involvement in this. Her facilitating all of this stuff, it would not be possible without her help on that front. There's only two more things that I want to touch on in terms of how Roger loves the lifestyle. I wanted to be thorough because I think a lot of us don't really realize how many different aspects of an athletic career there are, or the things that come along with it, the higher levels. And we might not realize that there are so many things to enjoy about the process, or we have so much control of being able to enjoy the process. So I wanted to do a deeper dive to make sure that we are extensive in covering this, because I don't think you're going to get that anywhere else. So something else that Roger really likes is, or he appreciates, is the career stages. A few years ago when we were together, he did want to see if he could get back to number one and win a slam. And he did that. But now it's about trying to enjoy his career and the different segments of it. At his age, he's not going to play 30 tournaments a year and chase a ranking. It's about making sure he plays well at the right time, which of course includes the majors. So Roger's not setting the same goals later in his career as he had earlier in his career. He's not chasing the same things, but he's still able to enjoy the stage that he's at. If he realizes he only wants to try to win majors and play in those tournaments and peak for those, he can enjoy that process without worrying about getting back to that world number one ranking. That's out of his mind, and he's able to really focus on what his new goals are. Roger also loves being an icon. So to me, this was interesting. A lot of people hide from celebrity, hide from the limelight. They look at it as a burden. That's not the case with Roger. Fame did not sit comfortably with some past champions such as Sampras, but as a young man, Federer had always felt he wanted celebrity. It was a desire, no doubt, intensified during the early years on tour when fans would ask him if he was Tommy Haas or Carlos Moya. While some encounters with his public can be a little unnerving, Federer continues to enjoy being an icon. As he once said, "I like being a star. I love being the magnet of people's attention. It's just as well that he does, otherwise his life would be intolerable." I thought this was kind of funny. Asked what he would have done instead of tennis, Federer said with a smile, before telling me he would have liked to have been Lenny Kravitz and played guitar in front of thousands of people. In fact, internationalism attracted Federer greatly. He came from a country with 3 official languages, was the son of a South African woman, and married an ex-tennis player of Slovakian origin. During the last years of his career, Federer took particular care to find out all the secret corners and facets of the city that he'd visited over and over again. To accomplish this, he took advantage of his mastery of German, English, and French, because as he sometimes said to himself, the more languages you speak, the more you understand the world. To me, that is, it's kind of making a bit more sense, where we see his background and how that folds into his interest and his tolerance of a lot of these things. Now, a part of this was also he really liked fashion, and he was able to do that through tennis. He met, I think it was Anna Wintour, who the movie The Devil Wears Prada is about. And she turned him on to fashion, and he became a fashion icon in that space. That's something he loved. He enjoyed being a part of that process and the creativity and the curiosity involved. So I'll end the what he loved section before we get into curiosity with a couple thoughts on, with us looking internally. So what part of our craft do we love? That to me is really interesting. For me, let's again look at podcasting. I love the process of research. That to me is fascinating. I love delivering that research. Something that's difficult for me, and one of the reasons why these episodes get so long is it's hard for me to cut anything, because I think each thing is so important. There's a unique insight in every quote that I bring in, or every insight that I provide. Maybe that's not the best for the listener. That's something I have to improve, but that's also something maybe I could outsource in the longer term and get someone to work on those things with me. So on the other side of that is, what do you not like? And can you eliminate that? Can you reframe that so it's something you enjoy? Or you don't even have to have that be a part of your life. I would imagine Roger doesn't love the organizational process so much. He likes being organized, but not necessarily organizing. And Mirka and his team helps greatly with that. Are there easy ways to start enjoying some of the things that you don't like about this process? So not just replacing, maybe we can, again, reframe something that we don't like. Early on, I didn't love talking to a camera, but I started to view that as a skill that I could develop to get better at communicating in general. And that completely changed things for me. I now really enjoy talking in front of a camera because it allows me to study and become more articulate, whether it is creating podcasts or whether it's just me talking with friends. So there's ways to flip some of these switches in our mind to start enjoying things that we maybe didn't before. Our imagination and how we frame things are very powerful forces. Curiosity, in my mind, is one of the ways that he's able to create this love for everything in his life. And we can talk about what the elements of curiosity are, as well as how it's exhibited in Federer's life. So why was Roger Federer curious, and what did it really do for him? If you're curious, you're always interested. Keeping interest may be the key to longevity in sport. So curiosity was what kept him interested. Interest is what kept him practicing. Practice is what made him good. And it seems to be this continuous pattern that starts with curiosity. Someone who was describing him, they said that maybe if Roger wasn't a tennis player or a musician, he would have been a reporter because he loved asking questions. He loved diving deeper into things. And I think that that's a trait, but it's also something that we can develop as well. You know, the more we get into something, the more curious we become, the more information we have, the more holes we have to fill, the more little stickiness that we create to find new information. And this is Paul Annacone on curiosity. The thing that was most appealing to me was how open-minded he was. He's interesting because he's interested. He doesn't want someone to tell him everything he likes to hear. He's interested in different perspectives. He's interested in a lot of stuff. He loved to play tennis and still loves to play tennis. So when we started together, I was amazed at his willingness to be open-minded about discussing and then trying different things to try to get more excellence from an already off-the-charts career. And he does it in a way that's very optimistic. It comes from a place of interest, not fear. It comes from a place of I'm curious, not from a fear of failure. And I think that his ability to differentiate allowed him to play at this level for so long. I think it really let him just kind of embrace being out there and enjoy the game. He has a very empathetic heart, and he's not just interested in the super elite of the world. He's interested in people and what makes the world go round. I think that, again, just gives you a solid perspective on life. I think what's really interesting to me in that is where the interest comes from. So Roger is interested because he's curious, and this curiosity is what's driving him rather than the fear of failure or the fear of not going well or the fear of losing ground. He is maybe more like a Lewis and Clark trying to explore and see what the frontier is rather than being pushed from behind. There's something that's pulling him rather than a fear that's pushing him towards an objective. And we saw this with plenty of the other athletes we studied. Both Tiger and Kobe were curious about what they were personally capable of. They were concerned with records and those types of things, but they were more concerned about how good they could possibly get. And that's maybe one of the most interesting questions to any athlete is, what am I capable of? And curiosity is something that can lead you along that path. Working with Federer, one of the most talented players in history, changed him as a coach too. I wasn't so sure you could be as approachable, and I wasn't so sure you could be as, I guess the word is, open to so many different things and still be at the level he's at. I was never around anyone that, during the US Open would go to a museum during the day with their kids for an hour and a half and then go play the night match. Pete never did that. Tim didn't do that. So at first I was nervous about it. And this is where Severin Luthi and Pier Paganini helped me a lot. Just helping me understand how these things keep Roger relaxed. They keep him very much at ease. They keep him enjoying his life. So Roger's team also fed into this curiosity. They really understood him. They helped him to create and satiate these things in his life. And we'll talk a little bit about in training how they were able to add to that. He invented stuff. I've never invented anything in tennis. I was just playing. I saw Bjorn Borg and I played like Bjorn. Roger came up with new things. There's a genius between his brain and his hand. In that respect, he reminds me of Maradona. Where does curiosity lead? Curiosity leads to innovation. So if Roger is pulling all these things in, he's not just absorbing it, he's curious and he's doing stuff with that information. You're also pushing your boundaries constantly if you're curious. You're saying, hey, is this possible? What if I tried it this way? There's no bounds, there's no framework that you have to work within. If you're curious, you can start with something concrete. You can start with Pete Sampras's serve, but the curiosity pushes you to refine it even more, to get to this place where it's truly your own. And I think that there's something beautiful in that. If for Roger, tennis is full of interesting people, interesting experiences, interesting competition, how could he possibly get tired of it? This was a sport all-encompassing that was able to satiate a lot of his curiosity over time. There's this dual purpose. It keeps him interested, but it also keeps him evolving because the rabbit hole has no end if he keeps going down the rabbit hole of tennis. There's an infinite amount of things to learn within just that specific domain. Here's a couple examples of curiosity and how it played out within tennis. After dinner, he said, "Hey, Jose, come to my room." So this is Jose Higueras, who's one of his coaches. And so I went to his room and we ended up watching matches until 1 a.m. What really impressed me about him is how interested he was about everything, asking you about everything. He knew the juniors, he knew everybody, and that was pretty refreshing to me, to be honest. Higueras convinced a skeptical Federer to start using a forehand drop shot on the clay as a change of pace. Federer was a quick study and won Estoril. He's also doing this when he's pursuing something new. He's playing doubles in the Davis Cup, he's playing doubles in a couple different things. And he's asking one of the doubles coaches for some information. Just the two of us, and I reckon we were probably in his room 90 minutes, McPherson said. I was amazed at how thorough he was and wanting to delve into the doubles and what he could do better as a doubles player. He's a student of the game, and this, for one of the few times in his career, was a very important doubles match. You could tell he didn't want to leave any stone unturned. That exhaustiveness of curiosity, not in terms of it's tiring, but you're so curious that you have to understand everything and unpack it, is something that I believe a lot of the greats exhibit. I also love how curious Roger was outside of tennis. My credo was just be interested. Be interested in all your things, Federer said. It could be your finances, be your agency, communication with your agent. It could be your sponsors, your taxes, whatever it is. Don't have other people make all those decisions for you. At the end of the day, if there's a problem, it's you who's at fault. That's my biggest advice to anyone. So what he's describing here is an internal locus of control. He believes that there are things that he is responsible for in his life. There are things obviously he isn't. He can't control how his opponent plays. He can't control a lot of these other things. But the stuff in his inner circle, the stuff related to his finances and the decisions around him, they are largely his. And by being curious about them, that gives him freedom to pay attention to them, but it also makes it not mundane and boring for him. People are very curious. I am too, he said. I'm curious about excellence, and I'm curious about genius in all different areas. And when you see an artist that's a genius and has excellence, I think human nature is to figure out what those ingredients are that make that. So maybe you can bring it to your life. And I know that I look at it, how can I help coach other people to get them to have some of these traits? You can't teach someone to have God-given talent that some of these people have, but the way they operate, there tends to be some traits, some commonalities that allows this excellence to flourish. I think a curiosity about excellence, and it's a curiosity about the execution and what they do to kind of shine. This is Roger effectively endorsing this podcast. That's exactly what we're trying to do here. It really spoke to me that he's describing this. We're looking at excellence. We're trying to pull out what we can from it, and we're trying to control for the factors that are natural ability or that are outside of our control. I would hope that Roger would like this podcast, that maybe he'll listen to it, that I'm doing on him, because to me, this is what it's all about. We're diving in, and curiosity, at least my curiosity, is allowing me to spend the time to research these people. And your curiosity is giving you the time to come and listen to something like this, where we're distilling a lot of this information. I realize these are fairly long, 2-3 hours, but I read probably 100 hours and listened to podcasts and all these things to condense it to a 3, 4, 5 hour podcast. Look, Bill Gates has been amazing for my foundation, Federer said. It's just so interesting to learn from him, to speak to him, to get to know his wife as well. All the team behind his foundation is a completely different size to my family foundation. To be honest, to be spending some time with him and seeing his support has been truly important to us. So when Roger's doing anything in his life, he is curious about it, and he's talking to the right people and learning about their stories. So if you're doing anything in your sport in particular, why wouldn't you keep playing? Why wouldn't you do this for a long period of time if it was stimulating to you, if it was satiating your curiosity, if you were so interested in it that you could keep learning about it in perpetuity? If we look at Roger compared to Tiger, probably at the late stage of their career, Roger never lost any of his joy for tennis. Whereas Tiger was starting to get tired of the mundane. He was getting tired of all of the things that come with golf. Maybe not with golf in and of itself, but it's kind of hard to separate at the highest level the sport from the requirements of media and some of these other things. I think curiosity is a little bit harder for us to create. We can always ask questions. We can always reframe things. We can always learn from other people. But how we develop our own curiosity, I think, is a little bit more up to us as individuals to find the threads within our domain that are most interesting and to keep pulling on them. So I would ask you, how curious are you about your craft? Are there specific elements where you can dive into deeper? Are there specific things you want to know? If we're looking at tennis, there's an infinite game just within serving in tennis. Or in golf, there's an infinite game just within putting and chipping. The narrower you go, the more you can find. When you look broadly at a sport, when you look broadly at anything, there isn't necessarily that much there at surface level. You really find the interesting things, in my opinion, when you start diving deeper. For me in this podcast, it's diving deep into the psychology, deep into the behaviors, deep into how the teams are built. The deeper I go, the more interesting stuff that I find and the more curious I become. So I would ask you, what would you like to dive into more? What subset of your sport, what unique individual thing can you really delve into and become a master of? Because again, I think that is one of the sparks that you really need. The next section, we're going to touch on variety. So variety, in my opinion, is how you can satiate curiosity without necessarily falling into the mundane. Roger's team did an incredible job of integrating variety into his lifestyle to keep it interesting for him, to avoid, again, that mundane, and to fend off boredom that can come with a lot of these things. So again, one of the best ways to keep things interesting for someone who is curious is through variety. Roger says it happens very quickly. I'm done. I don't want to do it anymore. I'm tired of it all. And really, that's what I try to avoid by having the proper schedule and the proper fun and the proper change. Because like you mentioned, if you do the same thing, it doesn't matter what you do too many times, all the time, too often, you get bored of it. It doesn't matter how extraordinary your life might be. So that's where I think these kinds of trips, or a good build-up practice session, or a great vacation, or some amazing tournaments in a row, toughing it out, whatever it might be, it's in the mix that I find the resources for more, the energy for more. Really, it's pretty simple that way. So Roger here is describing essentially how important variety is for him to avoid burnout over the course of his career. If we're talking in this episode about longevity, that seems to be a pretty important thing, is mixing it up, making sure that it doesn't become monotonous. Federer, who craves variety in many aspects of his life, would surely not have settled for 20 plus years of routine. So in personal self-help circles, in entrepreneurship, in essentially all of the zeitgeist for performance now, people constantly talk about routine and how important it is. I really like the book Atomic Habits. I think it's good. I think habits are good. But at the same time, for professional athletes, for people trying to achieve at the highest level, sometimes routine can hurt us. Sometimes routine becomes boring, and we don't want to do routine when it is boring. Sometimes variety can be something that spices things up. Let's think about if we're a golfer and we practice the same way every day, we hit the same shots, we go through the same thing. Are we really getting better? Are we really improving how we would perform on the actual golf course? The science actually suggests that that's the opposite of what is good. You'll have heard me at this point have talked to Will Wu, who's one of the leaders in motor learning control. And variety, randomness, these types of things actually help you ingrain new movement patterns and improve your performance quicker than repeatedly doing the same thing. So obviously there is room for routine and habits, but I think that we can get too wrapped up in that, and we don't value enough the importance of variety and randomness and spicing things up a little bit. So this need and interest in variety started from a young age. So I really liked the book Range by David Epstein. He talks about how Roger Federer was trying a bunch of different sports from an early age. He was playing around and experimenting. And I think that there's definitely something to that. Young Roger loved playing anything that involved the ball. When his head was barely higher than the table, he played table tennis, then tennis, football, squash, basketball. His favorite playmate became Marco Guidinelli, whom he had met during tennis training and shared with him the joy of playing, the urge to move and the desire to compete. They kept on playing when everyone else had already gone home. They also played for hours on the PlayStation or PC. So Roger is starting at a young age. He's doing a lot of things. He's clearly inclined to be physically active, and that's what he loves. He also plays video games, of course. But at that early stage, tennis was just one of Federer's many activities. He also played badminton, squash, basketball, and soccer. So there's many different sports that could help build hand-eye coordination. So something that I'm hypothesizing, I'll have to look more into the science around that. But with Roger in his early age, he's playing all these different ball sports. He's seeing how different balls react and move and do these types of things. That probably played a role in developing his hand-eye coordination at a young age. A lot of people said it seemed like time moved slower for him because his hand-eye coordination was so good. And part of it could be being built by playing all these different sports, getting the variety in training that he was seeing. So it's not just variety in training that keeps you stimulated. Variety in training can also help improve your performance. You look at a lot of the things that race car drivers do to improve their cognition speed and their reaction time. You look at what football players do. A lot of it doesn't necessarily involve a football. I think it's important to be sport specific, but you can also be a little bit more generalistic to build some of these general quickness or general agility or general mental processing skills. Roger did specialize, though, at a certain point of time. And so a lot of people might think that specialization runs in the face of variety. And I want to dive into that just a bit more. At age 12, he chose tennis over soccer. That was a late commit compared to some tennis prodigies. Agassi, Sampras, the Williams sisters, and Maria Sharapova were all in long before that stage. But it was not late compared to some of Federer's longtime rivals. Nadal, who grew up in the Spanish island of Mallorca, also chose tennis over soccer at age 12. Wawrinka, considered a late bloomer in tennis, played the game just once a week until age 11. At 16, after completing the compulsory number of years of instruction, he decided to stop his formal schooling and focus entirely on becoming a tennis professional. It was a bold move in a conservative, education-oriented society like Switzerland, one where sports, even in the late 1990s, were rarely viewed as a serious career pathway. I thought this story was kind of funny, so I included it. So he goes to the dentist, and the dentist is talking to him. He's in my mouth, and he's like, "So what are you doing now?" Federer remembered. And I'm like, "I'm playing tennis." And he goes, "Okay, what else?" And I'm like, "That's it." And he looked at me like, "That's it? Just tennis?" Federer changed dentists. I never went back because I felt like he's not really understanding what I'm trying to do here. I'm chasing a dream. I'm trying to aim for the stars, and he's trying to pull me back. And you know what? I don't want to be surrounded by people like this. So this is an early example of Roger choosing his inner circle, choosing who he associates with, being able to be self-sufficient and those types of things. And obviously Roger carries this forward with his own professional duties in his circles. But I also thought it was funny that he's facing the skepticism of specialization when you look at almost all athletes in the United States, and it's the opposite. It's, oh, why is he not only playing basketball right now? It seems to defy convention. And obviously Roger had success with this. Now, I want to be clear that I think specialization is important. You should largely be focusing on one sport over the course of things. There's only been maybe 2 or 3 athletes ever who have been able to play effectively at the highest level in more than one sport. You have Bo Jackson, you have Deion Sanders. But if we're talking about specialization, I would ask the question, did Roger truly specialize in tennis? Or is he lacking diversity in tennis? To me, if we dive down within tennis as a subsection, you have infinite variety still. You have different styles of play. You could be right-handed or left-handed. You have different philosophy and approaches to each aspect of the game: service, forehand, backhand, volleying, how you approach the court, your strategy that you have. So when you do narrow in, you still sort of open up to a lot more variety within your game, especially if you're training more and your body's getting stronger. You have access to more things within that domain as well. So by specializing, sometimes we actually open up the world. I mean, Roger didn't really like school. He wasn't necessarily good at school. Why would he add that variety in when it's not helping to contribute to his longer term goals of, getting to number 1 in the world? So I thought that was kind of an interesting take, is that yes, he's specializing, but for him, he is actually opening his world up by specializing in this way. And you'll see in his training, they incorporated things from all of these other sports to help him become better at tennis, which I think is a pretty powerful thing. Roger says himself, "I would tell all juniors and kids out there, do other sports too for fun. Go play squash, go ride your bike, go play basketball, go ski, whatever it is, until you're in the mid-teens, I think you can really do everything, and even later on too. Because if you start focusing too much on one sport, I feel like you can get burned out and start seeing the sport for a job rather than an actual hobby. And I still see tennis as my hobby that became my dream job, you know. I think it's really good for the mind to do different sports. And that is sort of balancing that line, as what Federer is saying is that if you're too focused on one thing, it becomes your job, you lack variety, you get bored. But there's probably a certain stage where you get to where the variety opens up, and it's a little bit later, once you've developed, once you've gained aptitude. Because the better you get, the more variety you have. I think intuitively that's what's coming out of this as well. Roger also had a tremendous amount of variety in his play style, which I think is pretty interesting. The variety that he craved in practice and the curiosity that he had led him to try a bunch of different things, and that gave him a lot of tools to work with. Roger was able to hit different shots. Some players play one-dimensional. They just stay back and hit ground strokes. We're seeing a more homogeneous, same kind of playing style. Variety is the spice of life. It relates to tennis and everything else. And the last thing I want to touch on specifically with variety is on variety in his training, and then we'll go more deeply into the other aspects of his training. That meant PC and PL, as Peter Carter and Peter Lundgren soon became known, often would opt for creative and quick-shifting drills and have their charges cross-train in a number of sports. They integrated squash, badminton, soccer, table tennis, and even floor hockey into the schedule in some form to keep things fresh and, above all, to keep young Federer's focus from meandering. So they're integrating all these things, they're adding this variety in, and they're doing it because it's a match for Federer. Maybe not everyone needs that. Maybe someone can go grind on the driving range for 4 or 5 hours at a time, no problem. But you also have to coach to the person. And if you want them to maximize their ability, this personalized structure to keep them engaged, this variety for Federer to satiate that curiosity was really important in that process. They're keeping range in training. They're pulling in the best things from these other sports. And that to me is something that we can all do to improve. Every great coach that I'm seeing now is cross-training in some way, and they're able to pull the best out of whatever other sport is out there to apply it to their own game in a unique way. We even hired a guy who came from a circus school to come in and do juggling with the players. So they're mixing it up in unique ways, but the players are developing different skills in this unique way as well. I don't think that there's anything really too far-fetched to be able to try if it could help enhance the hand-eye coordination or the motor skills that are out there. I also think that there's plenty of different ways to adopt and improve motor skills. So we have a couple different areas within sport. So we have agility, we have strength, we have hand-eye coordination. We don't necessarily need to work within our domain to train these things. We do need to work within our domain to train a forehand or a golf swing or something along those lines. But those can be separate, and you can add variety within those things, right? If I can train speed, agility, strength, and hand-eye coordination, doing things that are fundamentally different than the tennis training, that probably creates some good diversity for the athlete to keep them engaged across these things. If everything is too similar, it might really become monotonous. And you also have to know your athletes as well because of that, and yourself. I think it's pretty interesting how his group would design programs specifically for Roger. Dorochenko, a strong club-level player in France, recalls playing tennis with Federer at the training center on weekends in Biel and keeping it interesting for both men by having Federer play with his left hand. I worked a lot with him on his left hand, and by doing that, you improve the overall coordination and your brain becomes more symmetric, Dorochenko said. Federer was a creative type, a guy who did not have much concentration and who had lots of ups and downs. He broke rackets and threw matches. He was really not good in mental terms, and so we said, okay, let's construct tennis for Federer that fits Federer, and Peter Carter was really the constructor in chief. I don't think Federer knew all that was done for him, but it led to developing a technique that was totally made for him. Nobody made Federer fit into a mold. A mold was made to fit Federer. I think that is so important and very commonly overlooked. You see this in golf, you see this in all sorts of other instruction. It's very easy to fit someone into a mold. It's very difficult to build a mold to fit someone. And with almost every kid sport, everything that I see, we're doing the opposite. We're we're saying, hey, you should try this philosophy, you should try this methodology, you should try this, rather than saying, okay, what are your aptitudes? What do you like? How do you keep your interest? And you also see this with education. In education, it's probably even worse, where we're trying to put all these kids in a box in a classroom and teaching them the same stuff. Individual attention, in my opinion, is one of the most effective ways to build a program to help someone improve. And even athletes at the highest level, a lot of them are probably, without realizing it, being put into a mold. They just do what their coach is saying, and the coach isn't doing enough to really build a program that works specifically for them. So this is a big eye opener for me. I think probably Kobe followed along this path as well, as he created his own mold and brought people in to facilitate that. But I can't stress enough how important this point is and how meaningful it is to me, because it's frustrating for me to see, especially, for example, in jiu-jitsu, how every class is taught the exact same way. It's not taught effectively to maximize individual attention. It's not taught effectively to maximize individual skills and body types. And in sports where a body type dictates style, there's a huge need to be able to adapt things for the individuals. There's also variety in partners and locations. Ludi says, we like to mix it up. It's good to change. People don't always need to know where we practice. They also mixed up sparring partners, often bringing in young Swiss players like Jacob Paul, who grew up in Chur and later trained in Biel/Bienne at the National Center. I was at home once on holiday, and Ludi called me up out of the blue and asked me if I had time to practice, Paul told me. And I said, of course I have time. So I got to play with Roger at the little club. So something that I also thought was interesting about this is Roger's energy, his lack of focus. They did line up fairly well with ADHD symptoms. I'm not a doctor. I'm not saying I can diagnose this. I do have ADHD myself. I've been diagnosed, for a long time with that. And to me, it's interesting from a coaching and a personal perspective is if we have idiosyncrasies, or we think about things or view the world differently, or we behave differently, how do we coach to that specific mindset or that skill set? I would say a lot of athletes do have something similar where they have ADHD, they can hyperfocus, but they can also be completely disassociated. And I would love to get someone in to talk about the experience of that, but also a little bit about how maybe coaches and teams can cater to someone's needs that view the world a little bit differently. So in our own lives, how can we mix things up? So do we find ourselves getting bored with repetition? We looked in the Tiger episode about how gamification was very effective, building games that meet your skills and have specific objectives. There's also other similar sports we could play. There's, no way that Roger playing squash and playing badminton and playing these other racket sports really hurt his tennis. It probably helped him in the sense that he learned the range of motions. Even if you're doing something a little bit different, that refines how you feel the tennis racket. I think a common misconception, for example, with like golf, is that if you played baseball, your golf swing and your baseball swing, they could get mixed and you could mess them up. I can't remember if I talked with Will Wu about this, but is that really an issue? Because I believe we're probably learning different motor patterns and we're learning the range between those two things. So the more variety we have and the better we understand how our body moves in a whole, the better we can actually execute on the individual patterns that we have. And also, can we find coaches and a team that help us make these things more exciting? It can be a huge burden on the athlete to add the variety themselves. Are the people we're working with building that in an effective way? And if they're not, how do we get them to? Or if we need to find new people to do that, how do we go about doing that? In the next part, I'm going to touch on the training approach to longevity, the very specific things that they did outside of just the variety they were interjecting in. I think this is really interesting as we think about sleep, as we think about how we approach going to the gym every day. I think there's a lot of things we can really pull out of here that are valuable and actionable right now. So what's so special about Roger's training approach? I think it's important for us to look at this. A lot of people don't really know a lot about how Roger trains. And because of that, they believe that he's just this incredible natural talent that doesn't have to work that hard. That certainly is not the case. This is Pierre Paganini on how Roger trains. To have a potential is one thing, but to express it for 70 matches a year is something else. That's Roger's goal. to be consistent in each match he plays and each training session he does. I think we underestimate all the work Roger does, and it's a beautiful problem he has. We underestimate it because when we see Roger play, we see the artist who expresses himself. We forget almost that he has to work to get there, like watching a ballet dancer. You see the beauty, but you forget the work behind it. You have to work very, very hard to be that beautiful a dancer. That to me is a really interesting metaphor. I don't think, I would assume many of us believe that just because something is graceful because it's fluid, that it comes naturally, but that often isn't, or pretty much is never the case. There's some elements that come naturally, but just like for Roger's tennis, he has to work very hard to make it come off as natural or to exhibit and maximize the natural capabilities he has. This has also become increasingly important because Rafa Nadal, Novak Djokovic, they let people in to come watch them practice. Roger is fairly private about that. And so you see how hard these people are working when you have a glimpse into that, but Roger is not giving as many glimpses as well. And then this is one of the rare glimpses you get. It was a rare 37-minute and 4-second window into Federer's methods, including the short burst, high-intensity interval drills with Paganini that were full of variety. Like their dual juggling act with tennis balls to train his hand-eye coordination on the move, it's never routine, observed Emmanuel Planque, Puyol's coach, in an interview with Sophie Dorgan of L'Equipe. We'll see how my pronunciation is. There's always something new. His staff is always trying to surprise him and give him different looks. They keep him stimulated and on his toes. Severin takes a break and Ivan arrives. They alternate. To improve a player like that, you've got to surprise him. I feel their strategy is very good. So that's reiterating the variety that's being built in there. You can see it implemented in Pierre's work with him and all of these other things coming together. And it's not just that they're adding this variety, they're varying intensity, they're surprising him, they're allowing him to enjoy the process, but making it adequately challenging for him. Roger's philosophy on training is also interesting. So how does he view training? Is it just play? Is it hard work? What is it that he views about it? Roger says, I believe in a hard work's going to pay off kind of thing. Because early on, maybe I didn't always work my hardest. So as a kid, we learned about how he was lazy, how he just wanted to goof around and have fun. Roger having that context of what hard work isn't and what it is might be beneficial to him. It might make him be willing to push harder because he knows when he goes into that difficult territory, he gets more returns on his effort that he puts in. Yet before the start of the 2005 tennis campaign, and after a successful year that included 3 Grand Slam titles, he was frustrated that he had not had enough time to work on his game. The past year has been impossible. I went from tournament to tournament to tournament, and then I had to rest. So I didn't feel as though I had as much time on the practice court as I would have wanted. Practice is a must. If you don't practice, you won't improve. You stay the same place, and the other players will catch up. I'm determined to stay ahead of the rest. So this is a callback to Roger's goals of improving, or callback to his view of improvement, that he wants to continue to improve. And he recognizes that practice is important to that. He's directly linked his practice time to that improvement that he gets. And he's trying to make or build a way that he can get enough practice even when he's moving around all this time. I think a lot of people see Roger at the majors and see his training routine, the way he goes about things, and how lackadaisical he can be at times. But he's the complete opposite when he's away from the eyes of the public. He works the way you'd expect him to work. He's put in an enormous amount of work, not only on the tennis court, but also to protect his body. So this perception can be very different from reality. One thing I've read, which is interesting, is that a lot of kids who have high achieving parents don't necessarily achieve at the same level of their parents. And one of the reasons is because they don't see all the hard work that goes into the success. They just see the success. They see their parents with a fancy car, a nice house, being able to afford a lot of these things, but they don't see how hard they've grinded or worked to be able to get to that point. And as athletes, we do this a lot as well. We see the beautiful performance Federer has on the court. We see how a lot of these people go out and execute. And we believe that it comes completely naturally to them. We believe we're not as talented. If we saw all the hard work that was going in to the things that they're achieving, we'd probably push just a little bit harder. So to me, this is just a constant reminder of they're probably working harder than you think. and you should just work harder because of that as well. I had brought this up before as well when we were talking about his goals that were controllable, but Roger has a fairly broad approach to training. It's hard to define exactly what makes you a better player. I think that maybe your work ethic, being more professional, trying different things, your mental attitude, those kinds of things for me are more important than a specific shot that I work on before facing Rafa. The thing is that you can't just work on your game for the purpose of playing Rafa, because we were number 1 and 2 for such a long time, and now we are again. So we're only playing in the finals. To get there, we have to beat 4, 5, or 6 other players. No one plays like Rafa does, and the same is true for him about me. That's why it's not adequate to just focus on facing just one other player. So Roger is realizing he has to develop this broad skill set first, and then with the broad skill set, he can focus on individual, smaller, specific skills. It's not like he's not preparing specifically for Rafa when he's playing him, but Roger is very conscientious about improving his overall game and not necessarily becoming the specialist, because his goal is to win broadly, not just win individual matchups. There's also a clear balance that needs to be drawn in the practice. So you have to do the recovery, you have to do the mundane, but you have to keep it interesting. And an important thing for Roger and his team is to be able to figure out where to draw the line. And that could change from day to day. After a long lunch, he did not stretch or warm up again, but started back up quickly. I found that surprising for a 37-year-old with a history of back and knee problems. He should have done a bit more, and normally he does, Luthi said. Fitness trainer Pierre Paganini, typically part of such practices, was absent today, but both Federer and Luthi said it was important for Federer's mental freshness to not turn preparation into drudgery. Sometimes before the matches, the physio wants to do his job perfectly, and I have to tell him, we're not doing back exercises for 10 minutes, Luthi said. Sometimes we have to just compromise. It's different now with a body that's been on tour for 20 years. But Roger used to jump twice and start his match, so you can also overthink things and do all kinds of tapping and go nuts. So it isn't concrete. There isn't the specific thing he does every day. It's a balance between the physical and the mental side. We saw this with Kobe. Kobe needed to do specific things to get his body ready, but he also pulled different levers to get his mind ready to adapt to any of these situations. I think that is one of the most important things that I'm learning, particularly about Kobe and Federer here, is that their level of adaptability, their understanding of their body and their mind is very, very high. They understand these things so well, so they can adjust their routines to keep them stimulated, to keep themselves healthy, and to try to maximize their performance. It's also important to look into rest and recovery when he's practicing. We'll touch on rest and recovery in some other areas as well. But he and his team have created breaks when he needs it. And a lot of the time, when you're early in your career in particular, you're just go, trying to get to the next level. But sometimes less is more, and taking time off can be a benefit to your performance overall. And we're seeing this a lot in the NBA now. Because if you're constantly like this, he said, looking at his clenched fist, that's when you burn out. So you've never had a bit of burnout, I asked. He thought for a good 30 seconds before answering. If I do feel burnout coming on, what I've tried to do is break it down to the absolute minimum. And that's practice, matches, and family. All that goes without saying, but maybe then you do less press, less autographs, less stuff in the public eye. I'll practice off-site because I need to quickly gather myself, gather my energy for the main purpose, which is the match. I had a process of 3 or 4 months once where I asked the tour to help me out a little bit because I was just tired from the constant everyday grind of being in front of the media. Roger does enjoy the media. The media has helped him tremendously in his career, but he also understands his own limitations. So that's another angle, not just physical and mental tiredness. There's fatigue of people and demands on your time and attention. He also knows when he needs these breaks and is willing to advocate for himself to do this. And he also has these other areas of his life that he can rely on. Fortunately, he's also created very good relationships as the star of the league that he can get special treatment if he needs it. And that is an advantage of being dominant in your craft or being a really nice guy as well. Something that is repeatedly brought up by Roger and Paganini, who's his trainer, is that less can be more in terms of practice and training. With remarkable men like Rosewald in mind, Federer and Paganini had made a long-term plan for Federer to endure in 2004, shortly after he reached number one for the first time. They were convinced that less tennis could lead to more. They were correct, although the template worked only because Federer had the talent to flick half-volley winners from the backcourt and smack serves from under great pressure on the line. So I had read recently Shoe Dog about Phil Knight, and you hear a lot about Bill Bowerman in that book. And then from there, I listened to a podcast, a Founders Podcast episode on Bill Bowerman, who was one of the most famous track coaches at Oregon. And something that he was really stressing is that for runners, running less can really improve your performance. And he showcased this by the incredible success of the Oregon track team in the, like in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he was, the prevailing knowledge at the time was you run more, you get more miles, and you go faster. And that has been proven to not necessarily be the case. There is a science to recovery. There's a science to pacing. There's a science to a lot of these things. And it seems like Paganini was able to really tap into this. Something we don't think about is that if we're injured, we can't practice. And so by reducing injury, reducing load, we actually, over the course of our career, allow ourselves to practice dramatically more than someone who's constantly battling injuries. Because then they're dividing their time in rehab, dividing their time in all these other things. And they're spending less time on the court. They're spending less time doing the activities that have the largest impact on their success. This year, I played one tournament where I was basically in top shape, he told me, referring to the Australian Open. I don't think it cost me the rest of the season by playing the grass. I think the knee and the body needed a break, and taking 6 months off, I could take the time the body and the knee required to heal. Now I can look back and say, look, if now it doesn't go well, I did everything I possibly could. There are no regrets. So when it comes to injuries, rather than trying to get back as quick as possible, trying to test it, there's a benefit to letting it heal longer and putting yourself at 100%. From a psychological perspective, where he won't have any regrets that he came back too early or he tried to push it, and from a physical perspective, allowing him to recover. I think a lot of athletes get injured because they try to come back too quickly. There's pressure from a lot of people to do that, particularly in team sports. But as an individual sport athlete, you have some freedom to push back against that. Roger would also make sacrifices for this rest. And I don't think we talk about that enough. The compromises players make in their career in order to help them to perform at the highest level when they need to. It is in the interest of every national tennis hero to win the Davis Cup. But Federer had a historically distant and complicated relationship with his competition. With good reason, perhaps, because the players agree that a series in the Davis drains them physically and emotionally for nearly 3 weeks. The week before the clash, the week of play, and the one after. Even if you win, even more than the boost it provides in confidence, that is always useful in the sport. The Davis exhausts you, not to mention what it's like if you lose. So the Davis Cup is actually where Roger had some of his first success as a professional. He went on to beat the Americans in a round, and it's an event that he truly loves. He enjoys, he takes pride in representing Switzerland, but he also realizes that it takes a lot out of his career and his energy levels to participate in this event. So he didn't win a Davis Cup until very late in his career, when he realized that he had now the time to do it and could actually put in all of that effort without it compromising the other goals that he had. So even at the highest level, you do have to choose sometimes. And if you want to maximize your potential, sometimes you have to sacrifice things that you genuinely care about. Although this, over the scheme of things, was a small sacrifice because he did eventually win one for Switzerland. So there's also elements of the ability to recharge, knowing what recharges him, associated with these rests. So if he's just taking time off and goofing off, maybe that would recharge him. But clearly, family time is important, exploration, any of these things that help him develop a sense of awe or curiosity. I also want to call back and like hammer home that point one more time on Bill Bowerman, where less is more. The more you can practice over your career, the better. It doesn't necessarily matter if it's all in one sequential thing. If you're less injured, you have more hours you can put in general. A lot of this training was very sport and situation specific. So yes, there is range, there is variety, but when they're training for the tennis and skill side of this, they're very focused on doing tennis-specific drills. Something that is repeatedly mentioned is that it seems like Federer never sweats, he never looks tired, and part of that is because of how he's approaching training. For me, Pierre's the best fitness trainer in the world for tennis because he's the first one who really did drills and exercises that were completely specific, down to the detailed footwork, Rossett said. Even me, at my height, I moved relatively well with no big injuries. And if you look with Paganini and all of the players he trained, they really had relatively few injuries. You have to be strong, fast, coordinated, and have endurance in tennis, and you have to do drills for that, Paganini told me. But you also should never forget you have to use this on a tennis court, not on the road or in the pool. So you always have to create a link between the speed and the athletic way it's used on the court. 9 times out of 10 on the court, the speed is the first 3 steps, and then you're playing the tennis ball. So you have to train to be particularly strong with the first 3 steps. With Grand Slam singles matches, routinely stretching past 3 hours, you also have to train to be strong in the first 3 steps in the 5th set, not just the first set. What is required is what Paganini calls explosive endurance. This might read like an oxymoron at first. It's not, but it's definitely a challenge for a fitness trainer. So the idea of running a marathon or running a 10K, which is probably equivalent to how much they'd be running on the court, that doesn't transfer as well as the very specific exercises you do to replicate what's happening in these events. In training, you generally want to go beyond what's happening in the events. You want to push harder than what you're going to see in a major championship, so it feels a little bit easier in competition. For example, when you're training a combat sport, you're doing longer rounds than you'd have in the competition. So it feels, well, because whenever you're actually in the competition, it feels way shorter. And that's a good thing. In tennis, you don't do one sprint like a guy who does the 100 meters, Paganini said. You go for 3 hours or more, stop and go. That's very tough, but you have 25 seconds or 90 seconds to recover. In all the work you do, you have to stay aware of that. We don't ask you to beat a speed record. We ask you to be the fastest repeatedly for a long time. That's what makes tennis interesting. You don't run 40 kilometers when a match lasts 5 hours. You run perhaps 6 kilometers at most. You're not a marathon runner, but you need to be ready to play 80 matches a year, which is a lot. And the goal is to have explosive power for those 80 matches. The reactions and the explosive power in tennis are important because you never run a long way in tennis. You do a lot of stop and go, stop and go. You're pushing off again and again without stop and go. So it's interesting to think how he's breaking this down. So you have to be explosive for 3 steps, right? You have to be explosive for 3 steps over the course of a 3 or 4 hour game or a match. You also have to be explosive for those 3 or 4 steps over the course of an entire tournament. And then you go even higher and you have to be explosive throughout an entire year. And they're training specifically to be able to do that over that long period of time. I think a lot of the time we get wrapped up and we think, I just have to be explosive every game I play in. But if you're playing back-to-back games or something along those lines, you lose it in the second game because you hadn't trained to prepare for that. To me, this is such an important level of nuance of how someone trains, is that we have to think about the broad as well as the very narrow scope of how we're training for the specific task at hand. Short bursts of movement are a staple of the game, so Paganini logically decided to focus on training the burst, often while asking Federer and his athletes to perform a complex task requiring hand-eye coordination. So there's an aspect of cross-training to this as well. It'd probably be boring for Roger to just train and run all over the court. There's another level of stimulation that's also helping him. The important point with Pierre was always the quality of the footwork, Magdalena said. You had to be very precise with where you put your feet. Roger varies play a great deal, so if you vary a lot, it means you also have to have footwork that's more varied. That means you have to train to adapt to his type of game. It's why it's impossible to use one method with all the players. So you're talking about a lot of different things here again. I love how nuanced this is and how deep in the training we get. So footwork, obviously important, but for Roger, it's even more important. If he has all this variety, he has to develop a variety of footwork, and we have to train the footwork that he's going to use. If you're looking at another athlete who's maybe not coming to the net, who's playing a different style of game, they might have very different training based on how they would play their style of tennis. So it's again matching the specific sport to the time period and then the specific training to the athlete. This interconnectedness is a very powerful force. In one of the books that I read for this, which I really liked, it's called Federgraphica. It goes more into into how he plays tennis. And something that was really interesting is Federer takes dramatically less steps on the court than most of his opponents. There's a couple reasons for this. So he gets to more shots quickly, but he also plays a more aggressive and shorter style and quicker style of tennis. So if we're thinking about why he comes off and it seems like he has so much energy, like he's never tired, it's because he's working less hard than most of his opponents, which I think is pretty interesting. And if we're looking at that over the course of a career, if he's taking 20% less steps than Rafa over the course of 20 years, he's saving his body, he's saving those miles, he's able to reduce the probability of injury because he's moving so much less. To me, there's very powerful things in that compounding over time returns, not just in practice and being able to practice, but also in being able to save yourself injury in specific places by practicing smarter. Another aspect of the practice is that Roger would practice on big venues in the same scenarios that he would train in normally. So with that in mind, Federer decided to come to Paris early in 2005 and spend as much time as possible practicing on the center court in an attempt to get genuinely comfortable. So he knows that going to a place and practicing in a place helps you develop a level of comfort, helps you get familiar with atmosphere. Even little things like that can be an advantage. I'll have to find the study, but it was either chewing gum or just taking a test in the same room you studied can help increase your score on the test. We have spatial memory. We also have comfort levels in different places. And by doing things or in the same place as we practice or we execute positive things, we can start to bring some of that, I guess, juju into the circumstance as well. There was also a different aspect of cross training that I thought was interesting. So in tennis, you're playing across essentially now 3 different types of courts: grass, hard court, and clay. And Roger believed that there was crossover between grass and clay that could help him play better on either surface. His belief was that playing on clay would also help his chances on grass at Wimbledon, where he'd lost in the quarterfinals to Kevin Anderson in 5 sets in 2018 after holding a match point. "I think I was too long on the grass last year," he said. "I think playing on clay will help me just hitting through the ball full speed. When you play too much on grass, I feel you start guiding the ball, whereas on clay, you go with full swings. You have to earn it, so I think this could benefit me down the stretch. The biggest thing is I want to get back to Paris. I want to go back to clay." So there's range in learning across different surfaces. This is also another wrinkle. What surface do you practice on to maximize your performance across all surfaces? I didn't really see where they specifically covered that, but I'd love to talk with a tennis coach or tennis expert to figure out, hey, if I'm practicing most of the time on a certain style of court, what is the most beneficial in terms of injury prevention, in terms of a lot of these types of things? Roger's training is also highly adaptive. Both Roger and Rafa feel their bodies amazingly. They know exactly how much pressure they can put on their body. They always gave me great feedback, so I could adjust the practices. I always knew if you could push more or not. They have an incredible knowledge of the body. So this is similar to Kobe, as we described. You change the practice based on how they're feeling. You make the adjustments and are adaptable to what's going on. This is the quote that I really liked from Kobe in the other episode. "I never had a set routine, an ironclad formula that I practiced night after night. I listened to my body and let it inform my warm-up because there were always variables." That's very much the same case for Roger. That's very much the same case for even Rafa and some of these other tennis greats. Federer said he was paying much more attention then to off-court preparation. "For a few years now, I'm warming up more than ever, doing more stretching and massage," he said. "But I told the team, look, I can only do so much because I need to have a life. I need to be there for my kids, need to be there for my wife. I need to enjoy it. I can't be practicing for 1 hour and then spending 3 or 4 hours doing other things just to cope with the physical strain. So we found a good plan that works for me and for them." So it's not just adapting to how he's feeling on a day, he's adapting for the stage of his career and where his body's at in the longer term. I think that Roger does a really good job of having levels to this. So it's on a day basis, we do these things. On a month basis, we do these things. On a season basis, we do these things. And that's something that I haven't necessarily seen in the other athletes as effectively. Importantly, Roger is able to be very focused when it's important to be focused, and he can be very relaxed when it's important to be relaxed. He's very good at using the right amount of physical and mental energy. He works in the right way at the right moments, Paganini said. To work hard is one thing. It's another thing to know to work hard and then when to rest and for how long. It's when you work on the right things at the right time and with the right amount of energy that you get the greatest benefit. So again, this is another layer to this where it's not just that he can physically adapt to what's going on that day. He mentally can turn it off and turn it on when he needs to. And that is preserving his energy over time. So there's the psychological side of adaptability is, oh, I need to be intense here. I know I need to relax and turn that off here. And he can switch between those things unbelievably well. That to me is a great skill to develop in your career. Some people can always be on, but that might not necessarily lead to the greatest results over time. He also was able to adjust to wrinkles in his schedule. I'm not saying he didn't ever sleep. I just hadn't been around someone that had the flexibility in the approach that he does to so many things. At Wimbledon, he has different houses all the time, doesn't have superstitions. He doesn't always need to practice in the same place or have one favorite meal. This is in that same vein. But I was always amazed at how little sleep he needed to be energetic and optimistic. So sleep is something we'll touch on a little bit later, but Roger is able to be adaptable in all these areas of his life. And if we think about routine, ritual, habit, they can sometimes be a prison for us when we're trying to perform at the highest level. So if we don't do our routine, if the restaurant is out of our favorite meal that we eat every time before we play, that could affect our performance psychologically. I think that there is a lot of power in being adaptable. It's fine to have these routines. It's fine to have these rituals, but we should try to make them as bulletproof as possible if we're going to have them. And we should probably limit them as much as we can. When it comes to sleep, I'm going to do an episode, hopefully, on jet lag with one of my good friends who's specializing in that space. And I think that could help all of us, whether we're traveling for sport or we're traveling for business or any of these types of things. Sleep is so important, particularly to Federer. And I would love to learn more about that specific domain. An aspect of Roger's practice is experimental. Federer in a relaxed atmosphere of a practice session could be even more fun to watch than when he was swooping around the court when it counted. He was more animated and tried some outrageous shots, acutely angled slice backhands, off balls bouncing high above his head, full cut forehand half volleys at the baseline, flicks from unlikely places and positions. The extraordinary sneak attack by Roger, in which he moved quickly to return a serve straight off the bounce, was at first an improvisational practice move. So yes, there's intensity, yes, there's rigidness, but there's still playfulness. There's still Roger coming in and attacking and trying a lot of these different things. And that's what is allowing him to innovate. If we look at how practice is done, I think a good portion of it should be play, should be experimentation. That is how we grow. That is how we learn new movement patterns, and that's how we evolve. That doesn't go to say that the practices were not intense, and Roger could really get into the zone if he wanted to. He had the air of confidence that he walked in with. He was always smiling, always cracking jokes. His practices, I wouldn't say were super intense when he was a junior, but he turned that around later in his career or even early in his career. That's part of the reason why he became so good. But he was really down to earth, nice kid back then. So he's changed his approach to practice over time. That is one very clear thing we're observing. Every serve was with a purpose. It wasn't to serve for the sake of 200 serves. It was maybe 50 serves, but every single one was tight to the line. When you watch in that detail, you go, yeah, I totally understand why he's been as good as he has and why he makes it look so easy, because behind the scenes, the work's been done every single day. So we look at this hyper-focused state. When I was talking with Will Wu, he was saying that basically you should be mentally fatigued after 20 minutes of practice or so. You should be focusing so hard and so in the moment when you're practicing that is exhausting. And it seems like Roger is doing this. Something we do with studying is called the Pomodoro technique, where you're setting a timer, you're working for 20 minutes straight, no distractions, as hard as you can, and then you take a break. And it seems like this is in line with what Roger's doing as well. When I was training with him, he wasn't doing hours on the court. He might have done stuff away from me, But I think all of that work, especially when you're sort of 35 or 36 or something like that, all the work's done at that point. He knows what kind of makes him tick and what makes him produce the best results. For me, it was kind of an hour and a half, but it was intense. He'd always joke, but when it's time to train and be on the court, you could tell he worked on some things and did some things that were pretty special. That's an interesting observation from, I forget who this was who was practicing with him. But as Roger has evolved in his career, he also can limit his practice time because he knows what works for him and what doesn't work for him. Part of the curiosity, part of the learning, part of the variety is figuring out what makes you tick and being able to focus on the things that have the highest leverage and highest impact. And maybe just variety in general is something that improves those results. It was really telling when Roger was asked by a little girl how much he had to practice to become so good. And he said, it wasn't crucial how often you trained, but rather every time you go practice, you do it with joy and full of enthusiasm. So maybe that's a little secret about how Roger is approaching things. So rather than just putting in the hours, he believes the quality of the hours are more important, or how much you enjoy it, or the process associated with that. So what are your returns on practice time? So how do we maximize these? Obviously, I've talked with Will about motor learning control, about adding variety, about looking at end ranges, but it's also not about necessarily over practicing or grinding. Then we get massive diminishing returns over time on the things we put in. There's just a couple other things I want to touch on. So immediate feedback was something that's important. This is a small footnote, but it's something that I observed from Federer. So Fries sometimes fed him a ball by hand, stopping when the result was satisfactory and asking him to memorize the path that he had just made through the air with his racket. So when we're practicing, the best way to quickly iterate is to get immediate feedback. We do that in most sports. If you shoot and you make it, that tells you something. If you shoot and you miss it, you don't. But when you're trying to do a larger, more complicated movement pattern, like swinging a golf club or hitting a tennis ball, immediate feedback can be even more useful and more practical for getting the best results. Now let's look a little bit into conditioning, nutrition, and diet. This is obviously an important issue. I've touched on it a little bit in the past, but we go a little bit deeper here too. No detail is too small to be ignored. In sport, as in life, you look at the details. Then when you put all those details together, it amounts to a lot. That attention to detail extends to Federer's sleep and diet. Ideally, Federer has 10 hours of sleep a night. Anything less than that, there's danger of Federer waking up and thinking, I'm exhausted. Sleep is important to every athlete, even to a father of four. When the time comes to get up, Federer does not just want to feel as though he could leap out of bed. He wants to be so refreshed that he feels like he jumps out of his skin. It's Mirka, once described by Federer as the rock in my corner, who's enabled him to lead this circus life after the birth of their children and make the most of his tennis talent. Even before they became parents, Mirka was much more influential a figure than your average tennis other half, helped by the fact that she had also been a professional tennis player. So Mirka's helping him get the rest he needs. But let's think about that, how much sleep the Federer is getting. I mean, Kobe was working on 4 or 5 hours a night, and Tiger was also not sleeping a ton. There are physiological differences. Some people don't need as much sleep as other people. But I even heard a Kobe interview recently where he's talking about he was working so hard and he wasn't seeing the returns, and he realized himself that he needed to get more sleep. So there's also really good information and data on injury prevention related to sleep. So I watched this video, which I'll link in the show notes, with Matthew Walker, and he's talking about how there's a linear relationship between how much an athlete sleeps and their likelihood of injury. So basically, the more you sleep, the less likely you are to get injured over time. And you see this with LeBron James, Usain Bolt. They're both sleeping for hours, 10 hours, 11 hours at night, which is something, if we can, I would try to model as much as possible. And if you're maybe a younger athlete, you're up and coming, it's important to get those hours of sleep. I look back, and one of the things, very few things that I regret is when I was in high school, when I was growing, I didn't sleep as much as I probably should. I was staying up too late playing video games and doing stuff. Okay, so sleep is important, but also strength and diet are also important. With Federer now in his late teens, they worked on his diet and his strength. By the time Dorochenko left the Swiss Federation in early 2000, Federer could bench press more than 100 kilograms, which is around 225, despite his unimposing frame. He also had, for a young tennis player, a solid VO2 max, which boded well for his 5-set figure. The error people made looking at him was thinking that he was somewhat fragile, Dorochenko said. But he was strong, quite strong, and had a VO2 max of 62 at that stage, which for an attacking player was a high aerobic level. Mark Rossett, to give you comparison, was around 50. A good cyclist would be around 75 or 80. So you knew he would have no problem in terms of surviving a long match, and you can see how many 5-setters he went on to win during his career. He never collapsed. So there's something interesting in this, in the sense that there's baselines for his performance and strength and diet. I think we should always be tracking our metrics. As kind of a stats guy myself, that's something that I've seen a lot of people improve upon. And there's technologies, there's the Aura Ring, there's Whoop, there's a bunch of these different things that can help us evaluate these and not have to have coaches or exercise a lot of mental energy associated with that. We also have good feedback, immediate feedback on our performance and adaptability. So Roger and Kobe were able to develop and understand their bodies really well. Now we can have technology that gives us better feedback than that. So you can see how you slept. You can see if your body is still tired based on your heart rate variability, all through the technology that we have. So I'm a huge fan of technology that helps to do that. I think that can definitely help prevent injuries in the longer term as well. But for Dorochenko, the most striking aspect of Federer as an athlete was how dynamic and quick-footed he was. Federer was exceptional in plyometric training, where the focus is on repetitive explosive exercises like box jumps. He would shatter records, Dorochenko said. While others in 35 seconds could perhaps do 55 jumps, Federer would do 70. Really, he was a remarkable athlete. But because the mental side was fragile and the backhand had a tendency to break down, Peter Carter felt the focus needed to be on shortening the rally lengths. It's all about finding the number of shots that correspond best to you. For a guy like Borrega, the ideal rally was 11 shots or more. For Federer, it was 3, 4, or 5 shots. I am loving how everything is interwoven with his team. So the strength coach is talking to the tennis coach, and they're figuring out, hey, how do we maximize his capabilities, but also adjust it to how he plays and what his strengths and weaknesses are. And over time, how do we evolve this? You need Paganini's help to peer behind the curtain, where Federer lifts weights to loud music. In the past, he's worked out to trance, electronic, to heavier stuff such as Metallica and AC/DC. And he does interval training to prepare himself for short bursts of activity during a match. Oh, man, I forget what the book was, but there was pretty interesting science about music and getting hyped up. I'm going to maybe go back and do an episode on that because that was really interesting. Let me know on socials or in any form of comment if you think that would be interesting. The last part of that is related to his diet. So as a tennis player, most of his diet was heavy on pasta. Because of traveling, you always want to grab a safe bet, and a safe bet was always pasta. So as a kid, he was a vegetarian. He didn't enjoy a lot of variety with his food. And as he grew up, he started eating more meats and other things that would be better for his overall tennis diet. I also think, as we saw with his training and finding a middle ground, you also have to do that with food. So they're saying that pasta was a safe bet. Maybe he would have changed things up if he wasn't traveling as much, but he has to find what is safe wherever he goes. And it seems like pasta was something that he knew his body would process well and he could handle. Federer tends to eat porridge and berries on the morning of a match. He'd prefer to have a plate of croissants. In fact, Federer is not much of a breakfast person. He prefers lunch and dinner. But again, he's aware of the need to be professional. So this idea of professionalism is helping inform a lot of Roger's decisions around how he eats, how he trains and does these things. And his professionalism is linked directly to his idea of being a legend in the game. Now, the last thing I want to focus on is on areas of focus. So how does Roger train when he needs to improve his forehand or his backhand or to target for a specific opponent that he's facing? Let's look at just one example of this in terms of his strokes. Ljubicic, along with Luti, had some important work in the weeks building up to the tournament, not at least in remodeling Federer's backhand to make it more aggressive and a more potent shot to deploy against all opponents, but particularly against Nadal. For a day and a half before the final, Federer and his coaches discussed in depth and detail the strategy required to defeat Nadal. They had learned much from watching how Grigor Dimitrov a Bulgarian with strokes so similar to Federer's that he was previously known as Baby Fed, prevented Nadal from imposing himself on the 5-set semifinal. And here's just as importantly as he had a new attacking spirit in Berg, he resolved to take the ball early to prevent Nadal from controlling rallies with his topspin forehand. As Federer told himself before the final, the brave will be rewarded here. The worst case scenario was playing too conservatively, keeping the error count low, but losing. I didn't want to go down just making shots, seeing forehands rain down on me from Rafa. So there's a couple elements of improvement here that really stood out to me. So the first is that this is a group effort. This is a team effort to try to figure out how to evolve, but they're also looking at video. They're also doing a lot of this analysis and thinking more specifically when it comes time close to the tournament. So he's broad when he's practicing generally. When he knows who he's going to play, he can really hone down and create a game plan. That's different for every sport. You look at basketball in terms of scouting. You look at any of these sports in terms of scouting. But individual sports are kind of interesting because you have, in any event, so much variety between your opponents. I wanted to end this section with a quote that sort of brings everything together in my mind. In 2000, when we started working full-time again, I proposed a complex thing and sensed while he was doing it that it was more and more perfect. He then explained at the end why I had asked him to do it. It was fascinating to me. He had understood as an athlete how to do it, but also understood why. He had the internal and external aspects covered. He's not someone who consumes, he's someone who creates. So we look at his curiosity, we look at his approach to learning, we look at how his team has trained him. It all allows him to be creative. It all allows him to be well-informed and understand why everything is happening so he can do exactly what he needs to do to achieve the greatness that he's capable of. I really like how the love of the sport ties into his curiosity. His curiosity is met by variety, and then the training supports all of these pillars all the way up. So if we're approaching training, we're approaching recovery, we're approaching nutrition and diet, how could we improve upon this? Could we improve our recovery by taking better rests, having higher quality rest, maybe not scrolling on your phone when you're taking a break, going for a walk, spending time in nature? How do we view nutrition or diet? I think nutrition is completely relevant to the sport you're playing and the things that you want to achieve. And it's important to adapt those things for the goals that you have. Working with a team and a specialist could also help there. In terms of sleep, getting more sleep is usually good. I also recommend tracking your sleep and doing some of these types of things as well. There's a whole new science or a whole new amount of diagnostics that are available to everyone now that I highly encourage. I think something even small is getting a bed that you really like or finding a way to moderate your temperature at night. Also, how do we moderate our sport-specific training? Are we doing things that are too general for what we want to accomplish? Or are we not even getting enough range in our training where it's too specific to our sport? Again, we have to differentiate the general skills that we want to achieve, the strength and the hand-eye coordination, agility, and speed from the specific strokes that we need to make. And how is our team helping us get better? Is it just us? Are our coaches really on board with molding something to who we are? Or are we trying to fit into someone else's mold that doesn't necessarily work as well as it could? Again, I think that there's a big problem in sport and academia where we're trying to fit people into the mold, and we need to do a better job. And we can do a better job as athletes being really selective about people who can fit a mold to us rather than the other way around. That was part 3. So again, we covered Roger's goals, his love of the lifestyle, how curiosity and variety all both fed into that love. We also touched on his training approach and how this supported and enhanced his interests. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a rating. That's one of the best ways to give back to the show and help me to be able to continue to create content like this. Also, I'd love it if you tell a friend. I would request and have you be particular that you share this with someone that will benefit from it, who is a high achiever in their craft, looking to reach the pinnacle, or is an athlete or a coach. Again, reach out to me on social media if there are books that you'd like me to read, or you think they'd be interesting, or if there are other athletes you specifically want me to study. In part 3, we're going to go very deep into Roger's specific advantages and how he was able to create such a dominant legacy over the course of his career.